Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Kenneth Smith philosophy series. This is we're continuing our work on his forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm, which originally appeared as a column entitled End Times from 1998 to 2001 in the back of the Comics Journal. And in this book, Kenneth Smith is working on teaching us, helping us to learn to see the world through some perspective other than the modern perspective. And the particular exercise he's chosen for this book is to help us to see the world from the ancient perspective in its own terms, and then subsequently to see it from the medieval perspective in its own terms. And only after we've done those two to come back to the modern perspective and see how different it looks when we can look at it from outside itself, when we can see the things it takes for granted that are not necessarily so, that might just be an artifact of the modernist perspective. It's very interesting. And it's about trying to create some freedom, some potential for free will by being more than just a symptom of the worldview we were born into. So we're working our way through chapter 4, which is, only one chapter of a long book, and yet it's 1/3 of the exercise, because in this chapter he's trying to bring us up to date on the ancient perspective and how alien it is from ours. It's broken up into lettered sections. We're in section F, mythos and logos, and we're exploring the concepts that the ancients had, that mythos and logos were two different ways of knowing, and that it wasn't the case that logos was right and mythos was false. Right, a myth meant something other than a falsehood or a lie or a superstition. It meant a way of understanding the world, to understand specifically the parts of the world that don't lend themselves to rationality, that don't lend themselves to equations or logical syllogisms. The ancients had this understanding that there are finite, seemingly finite, apparently finite parts of the world, and those are well modeled mathematically or logically or in some other rational fashion. And then there are infinite parts of the world that do not lend themselves to such equations. And by infinite, we don't just mean some trivial infinity like the number of integers, which you can summarize very easily, but we mean something like, what is the state of every cell, every living cell anywhere in the cosmos? That is an infinite answer. There will never be an equation for that, and it's every cell is related to every other cell, and yet they're also all different from each other. They're individuated, they're adapted to their circumstances, and if that weren't enough, they're all constantly changing. That's not representable by a mathematical equation or a logical syllogism. And so for such matters, such infinite matters, the ancients understood that you needed a different way of knowing. And they argued that the human animal has two different ways of knowing built into us. We're born this way. Evolution has provided us with an immersive faculty that pays a lot of attention to what's going on, and a rational faculty that pays a lot less attention to what's going on and gets focused on its own theorems and ideas and equations, its pattern-making capabilities to enable the will to start to predict the future and to take control of it. And that these two faculties each are equally valid, which is why they evolved within us. So we're working on in the text, mythos and logos. We're in the middle of paragraph 4. Paragraph 4 begins, Greek myth was the confluence of many folk tales. We covered that before. We're now moving into the middle section. So I'm going to start us right into the text. Myths reveal oblique and difficult truths about human nature, which we'll come back to in a second, and about the peculiar warpage that specific appetites and ambitions lay upon human intelligence. So let's break this down. What's he talking about? By myths, he doesn't mean falsehoods. By myths, at this point in the section, he's established myths are to the infinite parts of the cosmos, the difficult to characterize parts of the cosmos, as formulae and laws and equations and syllogisms are to the finite parts of the cosmos. They use the subjective storytelling function to play the function of the finger pointing to the moon, that you are not to take the finger literally, but you are to understand that it refers to something greater than itself, and that the purpose of the myth is primarily to remind you of that larger, harder to characterize thing, and only secondarily to characterize it accurately. That is, it's mainly a function of trying to get us to stop ignoring the big things that we normally push into the background. So the purpose of a myth, as he says, is to reveal an oblique, that is, it's not easy to pin down and look straight at. and difficult truth. And by difficult, he means difficult to rationality. Stephen often asks about rationalism and rationality, and what are these things that moderns are so obsessed with? And you see it right off the bat with the fact that myths are designed to handle the kinds of truths that rationality is not designed to handle, that rationality can't cleanly handle. Now, to a modern, of course, this is blasphemy, right? Rationality will handle all things in time. We believe that there's no such thing as the infinite in the scale at which the Greeks designed myths to handle. We believe that everything infinite can be broken down into parts. We believe in the great machine universe, which everything is separable and can be understood as separate pieces that can be recombined. So this is it's easy for a modern to read this sentence other than the way Kenneth Smith means it. He's trying to put us in the headspace of an ancient. And an ancient understands there's two different faculties, and one of the faculties, myth making, mythos, is designed to handle the things that rationality, logos, can't handle. Reveals oblique and difficult truths about human nature. And this is another place where we see the difference between mythos and logos. Logos is, when you deal rationally with the world, you're supposed to be able to pick out your subject and talk about it objectively as it exists in itself, supposedly, right? This is the claim of all mathematics, all logic, all science, that we are saying how the world is in its own terms. But mythos, this alternative way of knowing, says that every time we look, we are tangled up with the thing that we're looking at, and that who we are and how we interpret the world changes the way that it appears to us. And therefore, to say something about the world is simultaneously to say something about ourselves, even if we don't recognize it. And so myths, where equations like E equals mc squared try to push into the background the observer or the scientist or anybody else and speak strictly about energy and mass and the speed of light, myths refuse to do that. Myths say, yeah, if we want to talk about energy or mass or the speed of light, we are also going to talk about the observer. We're going to talk about the subjective side, and we're going to talk about the difficulties involved in the relationship between them. Because as Heraclitus says, the human psyche, human character, the mind with which we process the world is itself one of these infinities that does not lend itself to rational analysis. Heraclitus says, you couldn't discover the limits of the soul even if you spent your whole life searching. Nothing but that. It just such as its profundity, its depth. It is an infinity. And ergo, the ancients believed that myths are a better mode for understanding the human animal and the problems we present to the world and ourselves than logical syllogisms or mathematical equations or laws or what have you. I'm going to pause here because Joseph's got his hand up and I'm excited. So go ahead, Joseph.
Thanks, Rick. I just have there's a couple of things really quickly. I mean, the idea that, we only see the parts, that we only analyze things through the parts. It kind of gets to what Donald was saying earlier about equations, how we apply equations to certain things and we don't necessarily know what they actually mean. So just thinking about that in terms, that how that relates to certain things like skepticism. But my real point that I was actually kind of curious about is how the mythos is Kenneth talking about mythos culture or mythos understanding as a way of tapping into our unconscious, much like Jung would actually look at it, or is he looking at it a little bit differently?
That's a great question. So, part of what he's really aligning here is logos with noesis and mythos with gnosis. And noesis is a lot more comfortable dealing with the conscious mind and with the world outside of the mind, the things that we see and encounter and so on. Whereas gnosis, because it's experiential and not so analytical, it can talk about the conscious mind and it can talk about the world outside of us, but it has a particular strength in talking about the unconscious, or what Kenneth likes to call the preconscious, the taken for granted things, the things that we've forgotten, the things that crop up in dreams or occasionally come back to us sometimes as a big surprise. Noesis tries to deal with the world under the pretense that it's seeing things objectively. And in order for that to hold true, it must not be unconsciously pushing anything into the background. It must be consciously selecting what's inherently important to a particular equation or situation, and that what it's doing there is entirely deliberative and correct. Right? These are assumptions built into the ceteris paribus foundation of noesis. And the problem with that is when we look at how the mind actually works, which is Hegel's critique of Kant, is that Kant was discussing some perfect ideal rationality, not the real one we're stuck with. When we look at how it actually works, we discover that the pushing into the background function is almost never conscious. I mean, maybe scientists at particular moments do it consciously. And maybe other people less disciplined still do it sometimes consciously. But most of the time, we're not even aware we're doing it. The universe, the cosmos is, an infinite number of things by comparison with the scale of a human being. And of those infinite number of things, our consciousness selects up to 7 plus or minus 2 things. And all that happens before we even start thinking. So for that reason, noesis can't describe itself and its own function very well, because it's sort of starting by denying the thing that it does as step one. Whereas gnosis begins right off the bat with, there are infinities around us that are out of our grasp. And even the human psyche includes such infinities, and therefore we don't have a complete grasp on ourselves either. So gnosis, right out of the gate, is able to critique both itself and noesis, and that includes the unconscious side in a way that noesis is. It's not that noesis can never do it, but rather that noesis is starting out of the gate hobbled.
Right.
All of its assumptions are backwards from being able to do this well. It's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
I can actually see how it relates to our bias and everything as well, so especially with noesis as well.
Yeah.
So talking about it, we're starting out hobbled, but thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Phil and then Donald. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems to me the problem of the separation, as I mentioned quite a long time ago, began with splitting of the stone. I mean, there has always been the aspect of the instrumental mind within the mythos construction representation, but like the Egyptians had this instrumental mind, but it was always, and the Babylonians and much of the Middle Eastern culture, but it was always an instrument within a larger context of a kind of mythic understanding, let's put it that way. But it was necessary. But it seems to me, if you want to, in a way, if you want to talk about modernity, you almost have to pin it down to the classical Greeks, because they took that a step further and they internalized that into theories and theorems that's possessed by the mind itself. So the instrument becomes part of the self. And so there began to be this sort of separation with the world by, in a sense, projecting this understanding into the world. So it already began there. I mean, it wasn't sharply there, but if you're going to pin it on anybody, it would be Plato. And it's just sort of developed. And when you got to Kant, of course, with David Hume, Kant tried to save that by reasserting the fact that the subjective self is actually in control of the world in some sense. But he did leave an opening, and the opening is, the noumena, which contain antinomies, contradictions, which is not going to deal with that part. So he still left room for that part. I mean, we're not going to deal with that. We're just going to deal strictly with the instrumental mind and its ability to decipher the world. And then, of course, came Hegel. And I wonder whether, I was having this question about I remember when Joe Seco made a review of Mission Impossible. Remember the line that I caught that was really interesting is that, that he said they mistitled that. It should not be called Mission Impossible. It should be called Mission Improbable. Okay. And I thought that was very clever. And I thought to myself, of course, not at that time, but later on, I thought, is probability a modern handling of the mythic understanding by bracketing possibilities within probabilities? I mean, that would be a very interesting instrumental overlay on the mythics, right? We're going to constrain it. So there's a kind of a relationship between possibilities and probabilities. And that is kind of an instrumental overlay of what mythic is. But I'm thinking, well, that's not quite the case. I mean, okay, that's a very clever little trick of modernity in terms of probabilities, statistics and so forth. Remember one time, there was lies, damn lies, and statistics. But now statistics is the latest manifestation of the instrumental mind. And so I'm thinking, however, the relationship between possibility and probabilities only deals with the known unknowns. Only the known unknowns. We still do not have any way of dealing in a modern thing about the unknown unknowns, right? And so that may cover a bit of that relationship, but it doesn't cover the actual deep antinomies about the unknown unknowns, because that's what we call the relationship between probabilities and possibilities and the black swan, right? That's what we call it. And so I'm thinking, but this also came in some ways in the classical era. I remember reading just a very brief blurb about Anaxagoras, and Anaxagoras drew the circle between the known and unknown world, and he sort of think that the instrumental thinking, in a way, logic, could deal with the known world within the boundaries. But he said within even the known boundaries, there are holes in the network of understanding, but we could fill those up because it's simply a matter of like further deduction, okay? But there's still the unknown. And he's sort of thinking, well, possibly we could expand that in a very slow way by creeping it forward, because the thing that's closest to the known and the unknown is that there's the known unknowns. We kind of know what's going on. Like the headlight does project its illumination within a certain distance. So he was interested, and he doesn't seem to be one of the major Greeks, but he seemed like already on the track of this probability sort of situation. So in some sense, we have to admit, at least on some level, that there is still that part that we don't, and we are at best caught in not heaven, but in purgatory. The space in between the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, very much so, as you said. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I don't think I've heard a better homage to Donald Rumsfeld. But anyway, that's not what I wanted to say. Just to read the sentence that we're on, myths reveal oblique and difficult truths about human nature. What strikes me about that is that I am a human nature. Now, where have we heard this before? Oh, Gnothe Seauton. It's like, it's maybe we are one of our own unknown unknowns.
Right.
But this is another, I mean, as we talked about this once before with like Bertrand Russell and his foundation, you know, when you get into this reflex, he had it in problems in sets, all formal languages, mathematics. It's, you know, if you read like Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, and Bach, it's all about reflexivity. When things turn on themselves, you know, it's easy to read this and say, oh, myths reveal difficult truths about human nature. Well, that helps me understand my neighbor. You know, you take that human nature as an object without even realizing that sometimes you are one yourself. This is myths are about self-knowledge. They help. I mean, if you know yourself, you understand other people better too. And by understanding other people, you can know yourself better. It works both ways, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, this is I mean, effectively the Oracle at Delphi by putting Gnothe Seauton up on the entrance, by inscribing it on the great pillar at the entrance. The Oracle is saying the very first problem is knowing yourself. And it's shocking to people because people assume they do know themselves. And the reason they know themselves is why not? Really, there's no basis at all for them to argue that they know themselves. And Hegel would say, well, they would argue that they know themselves because they're familiar with themselves. And that's where they went wrong. Because when something becomes familiar to you, you stop seeing it for what it truly is. It starts to become part of the background, and you forget that it's an object of study. And what Heraclitus is saying in that first fragment I shared is that you could spend your whole life trying to investigate your own character and still not get to the ends of it. It is one of the preeminent problems in our lives, which means that when we assume we already know it just because we're familiar with ourselves, we are making the biggest possible mistake we could ever make. And this is especially true when you examine his epistemology and Hegelian and so on that builds off of this, is the idea of if you don't know the lenses and mirrors through which you are looking, you don't know what their warpages and distortions are, that means you're going to take for granted everything those defective materials have to tell you about the world. Whereas if you know that they have problems, you can at least work to correct those errors. So, you know, there's this huge problem of epistemology built right into all of this. The unknown, the very first unknown is right at the gate. I mean, we screw up right out of the gate, and everything that comes after that is fruit of the poison tree, as they like to say in the law. So, you know, there's a reason why Heraclitus hammers this issue so hard. And I shared a number of these things here. I mean, when he says human nature has no real understanding, only the divine nature has it. And then there's the follow-up, man is not rational. Only what encompasses him is intelligent. Part of what he's doing is raising the bar on what we ought to classify as intelligence. He's saying, yeah, sure, we have this noetic faculty and it behaves like intelligence. We call it intelligence, but that doesn't make it intelligence. That if we intelligently critique intelligence and say, what would it have to be capable of doing to justify being called intelligence? The conclusion he reaches is that you, rather than a 7 plus or minus 2 register faculty for analyzing the world, you would need an infinite number of registers. That's why he makes the distinction between the human and the divine. The line between the human and the divine to the ancients is always the finite versus the infinite. So he's saying a finite intelligence is a kind of irrationality, because it's always overlooking things that it should have taken into account. And the fact that we glorify our own intelligence the way that people once glorified deities is this is that modern proposition that we have come to worship ourselves and our intellect at a level that it doesn't deserve. Because if we can deal cautiously with the limitations in our intelligence, then we can get a lot of value out of it, correcting for its problems. But the moment that we slip up and start mistaking a finite intelligence for an infinite intelligence is the point at which we stop looking for the errors that are built right into our system of knowing that the evolution gifted to us. And this is why he ends up saying most people, because they don't critique their own intelligence, because they confuse what a divine intelligence might look like with what a finite mortal intelligence looks like, because they mix those up, they walk through the world like sleepwalkers, as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them as they are during sleep, he says. And then in case we didn't get the point, he's got a separate fragment that says, don't do that. This isn't, we don't just say, it's genius. It's like, no, it's not genius. This is one of the terrible, terrible flaws of being immortal. Not just that we die, but that our methods of understanding the world are so limited. And the worst part of that limitation is not the limitation itself, which could be worked around, but that we forget that it's limited and we start to take that we confuse that limited intelligence with objectivity. This is why for the Greeks, you need mythos and logos. You need mythos to critique logos and vice versa. Now, I included his first fragment here, not just because of the sleepwalking references, but also to emphasize that whenever we talk about logos and the Greeks, we have a problem with our words. Because logos culture is referring to something very different than what Heraclitus is referring to in this passage or throughout his works with the logos. When he talks about the capital L logos, he's not talking about noesis. He's not talking about human rationality. He's saying the universe, the cosmos, has its own intelligence that's greater than ours. That's when he says only the divine nature has real understanding. When he says only what encompasses him is intelligent, he's saying there is an intelligence to the cosmos. There is an intelligence to the divine. That is what deserves to be called logos. And what we have is something significantly inferior to that we should always treat cautiously as a source of cognitive errors. And if we do, we can find our way through it, right? But if we don't, then we're going to be in trouble. So all of this is built, and Heraclitus, part of why I cite him so often, why Kenneth does, why Hegel does, is because coming before the classical age, which became increasingly a logos culture, an Apollonian culture, these earlier philosophers and the lyric poets who preceded them kind of better represented the original balanced Greek perspective, which is that rationality and irrationality need to be harnessed together and used to critique each other, to keep each other in balance. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say that on the question of what is rationality, at a simple level, the word means to measure. Now, we have the world of ideas, that big, fluffy world of ideas. It gives us such a hard time. What the rationalists would say about it, well, we worked on the world of physics, we worked on the world of nature, we created what we believe are a set of principles, a set of measurements of the natural world, which seem to work. But can we do that with the mind? It's very tricky, but basically the rationalist is trying to take a thought which he regards as being authenticated, validated, and then trying to measure the rest of thought and trying to find out now which thoughts measure up to the bar. They're the good thoughts, they're in the in pile, and thoughts which are silly, which don't measure up to the bar, well, they're in the out pile. It's a bit like, which souls end up in heaven and which souls end up in hell, I suppose. But that bar might be mathematics. They used to have a very strong belief that mathematics was the truth that couldn't be denied until, people like Gödel showed up. So it's this measuring process. We come to the realm of ideas, and rationality is taking a master thought, which we think is validated, and using it to measure all the other ideas. At a simple level, if I was to tell people about a horse, they can go and sort of see the master. They can go and look at the real horse and see if my idea measures up to the reality. But if I talk about unicorns, well, they can't actually go and check out a real unicorn. They can't go and check what the master is. So the master, in the case of a unicorn, is a purely abstract idea. It's at the complex level not referring to the objective world. That was just one thing I wanted to say, but I was just going to bring back the question of the in the Middle Age or the Dark Ages, there is a claim that effectively the Roman Church bans the individual spirit. The ancients had the idea that we were body, soul, and spirit. Now, if we had a spiritual aspect to ourselves, that means we're communing with the gods individually. But the Roman Church said, no, none of that. We are in the business of communing with God. You silly little people, you secular people outside the church, you worldly people, you've got passions and you have rationality, you have intellect. That was the qualities which the Roman Church allowed. The Orthodox Church ended up objecting to this. They retained a belief in the individual spirit. And today's interesting that what I think I'm seeing now in the modern world is the banning of the individual soul. You cannot think for yourself. You must obey the collective. You have no individual authenticity as a soul. That's an illusion you have. Only the mass collective can do the thinking for you. You're only allowed bodily passions. This is a very strange conspiracy. It was there in the Dark Ages, and they're twisting the knobs even more in the current age. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's sort of the end game of modernism, right? The modernism says everything can be systematized, quantified, rationalized, laid out into syllogisms and equations. And that goes, not only does that apply to the economy, it also applies to politics and the law. And, you know, if enough lawyers work for long enough time, we'll come up with a perfect system of laws that don't require any free will. You'll be able to just do what the laws tell you, and a good world will be the result. And this is sort of, you know, I'm sure most lawyers don't think that's what they're doing, but if you look at the relationship between the individual conscience and the law, the legal system still has a few ways for individual conscience or real world justice to slip in from time to time, but in many places it's absolutely trampled. I can't remember if it was the 90s when there was the Supreme Court ruling that just because new evidence comes out that proves that a man on death row could not possibly have committed the murder that he's slated to be executed for, does not mean that we save him. The Supreme Court ruled he had his day in court. Even if he's innocent, he needs to die now because the court has ruled. And they said so in more or less those words, which is the perfect embodiment of the modernist conception of justice. We have a process. Whatever sausage comes out of the other end of the process is ipso facto justice because we say so. And it doesn't matter whether it matches the real world or human subjectivity or anything else. What matters is the system was followed. And so what you're describing, you know, is consistent with this movement under modernity that, you know, we're going to make this beautiful, perfect system, and every other consideration will be, you know, subjected to it, will be subordinate to it. The fact that it crops up in place after place after place within our culture in different ways, whether it's at a religious level, whether it's at a economic level or artistic level or what have you. This is just the working out of, the world spirit of the time, as Hegel would say, is the zeitgeist of modernity.
Well, the positive approach was to take those flags, A and Z, plant them in one piece of the sand, another. We only regard what is in between those flags as important. The rest we're going to throw away. Fair enough. They've actually taken another step. They're telling us that what exists outside the flags doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the law of the excluded middle in action, right? Things you're either an American or a Russian or an Englishman, but at any rate, you belong to some nation. And that's true of every resource, every crop of land, everything. It has a place that it's in, and it's in that place, and it's not in any other place. And the laws of that place apply to you and not any other laws, unless they've agreed to them. That you're either alive or dead. Things or statements are either true or false. And the reason for this kind of absolute insistence on excluding the middle has nothing to do with nature and reality. As Heraclitus is fond of pointing out, nature is full of paradoxes from a human perspective. Countless things refuse to resolve into true or false, right? The stepping into the same river. Can you step into the same river is one of his classics. Well, the river's changing and so are you. So, is the person who completes the step the same as the person who began the step? This is more than just an esoteric, entertaining question. It really goes to the heart of whether the excluded middle is a legitimate characterization of the world. But modernity doesn't care, because the important thing to modernity is reality must be reduced down to categories and properties that lend themselves to equations. Most classical European syllogistic logic has a much easier time with true or false than it does with all these shades of things in between, things that are sometimes true or partly true. It's like, that's ugly. So, for our systems to churn out the sausage correctly, you must either be in it or out of it. You can't be some of both or neither at the same time. And Eric says in the comments, I'm generalizing, and he's right. Of course, I'm generalizing. There's ways in which the legal system, modernist legal systems, have not finished modernizing. This is a process that's been going on for 500 years. You can see there is a lot of change in how the law is applied today compared to, say, 1500. Just an enormous amount of change. The Supreme Court statement in the 90s was just one of those moments, like when Pico della Mirandola wrote his essays, at which you say, well, here is a crisp characterization we haven't seen before that brings a lot of things into focus for us. In any epoch, the Hegelian take on it is that it isn't just what it is. It's also got enormous amounts of what came before, and it's also got burgeoning amounts of what's going to come in the future. There's always this tension between, which of these interpretations of law or art or economics is going to apply. It's never pure. Phil, and then Joseph, and then we'll move on in the text. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I wonder whether it doesn't come down, in a sense, to mediation. I mean, the part I agree with Kant is that we do just experience the world. So therefore, in one sense, we could never really possess the object in the self, but the representation of the object. That part I actually agree with. So therefore, we receive these images, these experiences, and in some sense, that's already mediated. It's a question of how much is mediated, whether it's like we invent a God, or there is a God that mediates nature, or whether it's just experience. And it seems to me that the quantity of mediations, which are in some sense the derivative, is like the first derivative may be pretty close to the second derivative, which is in some sense the derivative of the derivative. At some point, it becomes so distant, it becomes sort of somewhat abstract, and yet we believe in the derivatives more than we believe in the thing itself. I want to think about the first question I want to ask was that let's imagine that the derivative of the oracles in Delphi. I mean, that is a mediation. I mean, it is not nature itself, the thing itself, which requires interpretation, even with the mediation. The mediation immediately requires interpretation. And this really relates to Donald's question about the reflexivity in a sense of mediation to the self. I mean, what happens between, let's imagine Oedipus going to the oracle and Hamlet going to the oracle, right? The oracle essentially will say, the beating will continue until you behave correctly. That's essentially what it would say, right? And eventually, it took a long time, but Oedipus finally got it, right? You know, stop the beating already. You know, I'm going to go to Colonus and just try to figure this out. Figure out your mediation, your oracle. Hamlet is so self-reflexive, so internalized, that the beating continues, and he never relinquishes. He is so internalized, to the degree he even asks, to be or not to be? That is a question, right? Is he already so ingrained in this sort of modern trap of self-induced mediation that, go ahead, beat me some more. Not only beat me, beat everybody I love. I can't give it up. So those two characters are very different, because at least with Oedipus, you know, like finally, after much beating, he finally said, I got it. I think I'm going to have to retire and just think this over. But not Hamlet. Not Hamlet. So I think maybe in some sense, humanity in developing this psyche that's very powerful is unable to give up the mediation. And the mediation on certain level is good. You have to have that in order to, in a sense, be fully engaged with the entanglement with the world, right?
Yeah.
So in some sense, the question is, how do you find a balance? I keep emphasizing the balance is knowing how to equivocate between the mediation, understanding is a representation, and rather than being stuck on something, you know, we always get stuck on something. So that was my thought. And I say, if there's anything about that, is like the tragedy begin from the first, when we discover, you know, we have this tool that is a very powerful tool. And now, as I said before, when Adam and Eve ate the apple, were they thrown out of the Garden of Eden, or did they give the old man the middle finger salute, right? As they left, right? Now that we got the sequence, the secret of mediation, by the way, we don't need you anymore. So that's why we're caught in east of Eden. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, mediacy versus immediacy is another interesting angle on noesis versus gnosis, right? Because, you know, the purpose of the gnosic faculty is to form a whole between ourselves and the larger world, that we are so attending to what we're smelling and hearing and sensing and feeling that we're almost inseparable from the world. We're almost a part of the world. the sun rises and we gaze at the sun, not through a choice, but because we're so connected to it, but you shift into the negated mode that Hegel talks about of noesis, and now there is a mediacy going on. Your mind is your noetic faculties are mediating between the experience and your reaction to it. And it's an interesting dialectic, and of course it goes back to what Stephen talked about a few weeks ago about, is Hamlet the modern Oedipus, showing, raising the questions of what are the typical problems of the modern world? Do we over mediate to the point that we're disconnected and unable to act? And then we're back to Hannah Arendt. So anyway, let's let Joseph and then Sharon. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, because I think it bears worth repeating, kind of the point that Stephen brought up, which was essentially this idea between the mass collective and the individual, and the stories that are told, and how this either or proposition is kind of given to us in this, and it's either mass collective or the individual, that stories people tell themselves, in that think of it in terms of an individual that has done it on their own, the kind of the American idea of, individualism. But then there's the other idea, the mass collective, where you kind of have to conform to all the types of thinking that everybody is the dogma of the day, whatever it has to be. And it's interesting because it's kind of both. Somewhere in between is where the truth lies. It's between the community and the individual, and the individual and the community. And it appears to me that modernity ignores that. And that's the law of excluded middle that you were talking about. But it's even more interesting that the way we compared it to the law on the economy, because that's a classic example of looking at the parts and not the whole, and how the individuals will actually identify through that, and the mass collective will identify through the law or through the economy, through their perspectives. And that's a classic example of missing what else there is in the world. So then there's this just one particular type of thinking that goes into this mass collective thinking, that you have to be, a capitalist or a communist. You have to be, you can't be in between. You have to be, a certain type of legals, believe in certain types of legal systems or belief systems, or you have to be like, you have to believe in a evolutionary form of law, or a dogmatic form of law, like, and where it's only this is the way the law is written, this is how it has to be, and almost religious in nature. And so that, but those are only two parts of a greater whole. That's the whole point. But people identify with themselves within that construct, and that's highly problematic on a number of levels. And so you start to see that, and you wonder why we missed the whole part. Like, why that if you're going to look at an economy and say, oh, it's natural to it's, that certain schools of thought based on only a laissez-faire kind of approach, that's rooted in nature because it's the survival of the fittest. And it's like, well, no, you need regulations, you need things like that are in place. You may not need everything regulated, but you may need, you need other things in place in order to function properly. But the whole point I'm trying to make here is that these are perfect examples of using the part to what you're identifying through the part and not the whole, and that and we do that, individualistically and collectively, and that's almost a quantitative or even dogmatic way of looking at the world, and neither which work. It's
Right.
almost the individualistic way is almost a religious kind of approach. And a mass way is like kind of this analytical, very analytical way of looking at the world where everything has to fit an equation, and that there's no in between, and then people wonder why there are issues. Anyway, I know that that's a little bit all over the place, but it also expresses the importance of mythos culture within that framework.
It does. Yeah.
A little abstract, but
It's okay. Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, there's the idea that, I mean, we're always struggling with the man with the hammer problem, right? Whatever our favorite mental faculty is, and most of us have a favorite mental faculty, we want it to be the solution to all problems. If when we go into an ultra noetic mode, as modernism encourages us to do, we want to believe that everything will lend itself to systematic handling through equations and laws and syllogisms and so forth. We want that to be true in a sort of circular way. We start to believe it must be true, despite the fact there's plenty of evidence that it's not. But the reason it must be true is because if it's not true, then our entire life strategy is a failure. And we don't want it. We don't want to reevaluate our life strategy. We don't want to go back and revalue all the things we've done in our life and say, I thought it was a victory, but was it a catastrophe? We don't want to ask these questions. They hurt too much. So it's so easy and natural for us to just slip parts of the world into the background so that we don't notice them anymore, that becomes our strategy for life. And so whatever our ideology is that we're obsessed with, whether it's only the collective is good or only the individual is good, or whatever little recipe we have to, full of thought-turning cliches to keep us from having to deal with the full complexity of the truth, we have no problem suppressing the evidence to the contrary. It just comes, it's the natural functioning of the noetic mind to do that. Otherwise, noesis wouldn't work at all. It's part of what's interesting. There were two editions of Between Past and Future by Hannah Arendt. And the first edition, which was in the early 60s, only had 6 chapters. And late in the 60s, 68 or 69, she came out with a new edition that had 8. And chapter 7 in the later edition is called Truth and Politics. I've mentioned it before. But part of what I love about it is the way she talks about the 3 incompatible forms of things that are true, and that they can't be expressed in each other's terms. And yet people relentlessly try to re-express them in whichever terms they're most comfortable with. So you get, for example, strictly noetic truth of the form with systematic analytical thinking, things like E equals MC squared, where, the thing about E equals MC squared is that it has a relationship to reality, so that given enough time, anybody or any culture or any succession of cultures could eventually rediscover that truth. You don't need, it's handy to be told it to get a jump up on history, but you don't have to be told it because you could discover it for yourself. Or, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. You go all the way back to Pythagoras, right? It's there in the right triangle waiting to be found. There doesn't have to be a law telling you that it's so. It's there, right? Waiting to be found. And then she talks about political truth and how that's based on consensus, or at least majority rule. What can you get enough people to agree on? Like if we decide that we're going to, invest in a new national educational initiative, and we get the votes to do it, well, then it becomes true because we voted and made it happen. And the problem, she says, is that people whose lives are dominated by the political start to think that all forms of truth must be political, and that the truth has an obligation to satisfy a majority. And she says that's absolutely not true. For most of history, nobody knew E equals MC squared. They didn't know that, but it was true that whole time, despite the fact nobody would have voted for it. Now she says that's still an easier case than the third form of truth, because eventually a culture will find out that E equals MC squared. The ones that reject it will eventually fail compared to the ones that pursue it. She says, but there is a third form of truth, which is things that you either were there to experience or you weren't. And if you weren't there, you missed it. And that moment can't be summed up in a logical syllogism. There's never going to be an equation to prove to somebody that you were there that day on the dock eating an ice cream cone when a seagull came up and did this amazing thing and then flew away. It really happened, but it can't be derived from an equation. And it also isn't subject to a vote. It doesn't matter if every person on the earth votes and says that didn't happen. It still did. And you witnessed it, right? And she says this thing, which you might call existential truth, is doubly rude, because not only is it not willing to bend to the vote, it's also not willing to bend to an equation. You can't get at it either way. You simply had to experience it. And in these three forms of truth, she's exploring, without using the word, she's exploring the difference between gnosis and two different forms of noesis: the social noesis, where it's the systems of the culture that decide the truth, and sort of analytical scientific noesis, where the relationship with reality results in creating a systematic description of part of the truth. She says, yeah, this is her explanation for why, when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, so many of her friends and peers disowned her, because they didn't like the truth that she witnessed, and they decided that they could just vote her out. Like, if we just agreed that you're wrong, it must make you wrong. Eichmann has to have horns and a tail and a mustache he twirls. He must have an evil laugh. He must be filled with hatred, because we decided that that was true. So it's true whether it's true or not. It must be true. We need it to be true. And more importantly, there's more of us than there are of you, so you lose. Haha. And so she found herself marginalized by the late 60s. Nobody wanted to hear, wow, Nazis are a lot like us. A lot of the things that we do lend themselves to fascism, like on a turn of a dime. And not just fascism, because of course in Origins of Totalitarianism, she compared fascism closely to, Stalinist Russia and any systematic form in which the individual is trampled underneath of an ideology. She unites those in that. And she says, it may be convenient to our self-esteem to tell ourselves that the people who did those things were monsters who were insane and totally different from us, and that they were, to use Stephen's favorite term, they were irrational, and that rational people would never do those things. This may be convenient to us, but based on studying Eichmann at the trial in Jerusalem, it just isn't true. And that people's response was, well, we didn't experience that, and we don't like that, so we're just going to vote you out. You are no longer legitimate. We aren't going to listen to you anymore. There's more of us, so screw you. And in exploring this, she's hitting upon a deep Hegelian issue. And it goes back to the ancient perspective that we're talking about with mythos and logos, which is we have these different faculties, and they see the world very differently from each other. And yet each of them can convince itself that it's seeing the world as it actually is, even though the different faculties are giving incompatible pictures. And this is how people sort themselves into, the Banausoi, the Douloi, the Aristoi. It's their preference of perspectives starts to become a feedback loop that reinforces the continued use of their favorite faculty, and the avoidance of the other faculty and demonization of that other faculty as the source of all evil. There's a whole bunch of complicated interrelationships here between the ontology of, how did we evolve, what did we turn into, and the epistemology of how do we understand that, and how do we try to understand the world, and how is that dependent upon it. Stephen, and then Sharon, and then back to the text. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'll probably just bring up Nietzsche's point again, the one that came up in his notebooks as a background to The Will to Power, where he warns of the danger in the transition away from Christianity. In Christianity, every person had a soul. You could be a nobody lying in the gutter, and society doesn't think much of you, but to the Christian, you still had a soul that was valuable to God. You still mattered. You were still a number. But the plan now seems to be to erase the soul so you no longer matter. You'll be a number in our system, and we can reduce you to zero. The Christian system essentially couldn't do that. It couldn't say any person was a zero, because God has an investment in every individual. But we've gotten rid of God. We've gotten rid of the soul. I was going to say that I've wondered about the Wizard of Oz, and you look at civilization. Civilization developed in the Middle East. I'd even point out to disbelief that the axial age began in the Middle East. The Greeks only followed. I'll be burned at the stake for that one very soon, because the Greeks, you know, these Middle Eastern guys, they built pyramids and it was all very nice. They did some things, but it was the Greeks who invented the modern world.
So we
It
say.
didn't come from the Middle East. But, you know, you get Dorothy's wandered out of the ancient Orient with civilization, has come to barbarian Europe, and she meets the free monsters. She meets the scarecrow. She meets Oedipus, the person who is being mindless. And that's the Greco-Latins, who, precisely because they suffer from that dilemma, have to develop rationality to overcome their irrational nature. The other monster are the Teutonics. What do the Teutonics always appear in history as? There's a bully, the cowardly lion. So in the Teutonic, we see the extremes between cowardice and courage. The other creature she meets in Europe are the Russians, who seem to be merciless machines without a heart. So there's your three monsters. So I don't know if the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz was intending that, but you could take that picture and view Europe through that lens. Thank you.
Man, I would gladly read an essay about that. That's an interesting take on Dorothy's three companions. I'd love to read an expansion of that. Thanks for sharing that. Sharon and then Zelig and then the text. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just want to say I like your explanation of the three truths according to Hannah Arendt. Is in the society in which we live today, what is the truth? So I'd like to go back to the text and ask a question around the sentence in which I'm going to read. It's the second sentence from the bottom, where it says, myth is a condensed or metaphoric presentation of primal psychology, and thus a nomenclature or taxonomy for human vices and virtues. The latent powers to which humans are subject are made palpable to intuitive minds in the form of allegories or symbolic stories. And so the reference I'd like to make is the culture in which we live have got many myths. And in fact, I think Joseph alluded to one, the self-made man. That's an American myth, I think. And I was trying to Google and see which others are there, because we live by them in this culture. So can you expound on that for a bit?
Sure.
Which will make it a lot more pragmatic. I know the Greeks had theirs, but we have ours too, and we live by them.
Yes. Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, this again, here we hit a terminology problem, because to a modern, a myth is some kind of story or lie. Whereas to an ancient, a myth is specifically a formulation of part of reality that's difficult to express logically or mathematically or systematically, and therefore must be done through stories. So that is to say, all myths may be stories, but not all stories are myths. And since moderns equate the word story and myth, this relationship is now impossible to express, because now it sounds like we're saying not all myths are myths. But effectively, not all myths in the modern sense are myths in the ancient sense. So the story of the self-made man is a paradigm. I think the term we want here is paradigm. What we can borrow from Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and say this is an example, a story that serves as an example that we can then hold other people to. But whether it's a myth or not, it depends on if we're using the modern definition or the ancient definition. If we're using the ancient definition, it would have to be accurately pointing us at critical and profound parts of the real world. It couldn't be misleading us. In the ancient perspective, if it's misleading us, it's a pseudo myth or an anti-myth rather than a genuine myth. It's rather than opening our eye, rather than dilating our perspective to be able to encompass part of infinite nature that we need to pay attention to, it's replacing nature with an ideology, sort of a thought-terminating cliche. This is one of my favorite expressions these days, is thought-terminating cliche. All ideologies are structured around rules of thinking and thought-terminating cliches, so that whatever thought you begin to have, you quickly run against one of these rules that tells you, okay, now you need to turn right again, and now you've arrived at the finish line, and the finish line will be some thought-terminating cliche like the self-made man. And the thought-terminating, or that the market is evolution in action and is a meritocracy that represents survival of the fittest. That's a thought-terminating cliche. You're not invited to question whether it's true. You're invited to finish any discussion of the market with, ergo, the best rise to the top and the worst go to the bottom, and that's how it should be. The end, period. Thought terminated, right? So self-made man sort of serves that role. If a line of thought leads you to characterize a situation as, well, this must be true because he's a self-made man, or because he should have been a self-made man, but he failed to, and therefore he deserves to be pushed down in the market and to fail economically. All of this is playing under the ideology that the modern economic structures are the right ones. And the reason they're right is that they represent the action of science itself, the cosmos itself, evolution in action, even though that's just a metaphor and there's no actual basis for it. A more classic example of a myth is the structure of a Greek tragedy, for example. The idea that all of your virtues can work against you under certain circumstances, so that the harder you try, the worse you make things for yourself. This is part of the human condition that's really difficult to accept. And so if somebody wasn't giving you these examples, then you wouldn't have this warning. Every generation, every person who's born has to go through the experience of, at some point in their life, finding themselves in a situation where the harder they dig, the deeper the hole gets, and they can't figure out why it's getting worse instead of better. But if you've actually been given the myth of the example of Oedipus or any other classic tragedy, then you don't have to discover this from scratch in your own life. You can say, oh, I recognize what's happening. It's like that myth where this thing happens. This is what's happening to me. And so now, instead of shutting down your thinking and getting you to accept the status quo, a genuine myth gets you to open up your thinking and say, there are whole sides of this I wasn't even thinking about. And now I can change strategies because I see what was invisible before. Does that make sense, Sharon?
Yes. For me, it's a little difficult concept to grasp, because myths are stories, but we live by those stories. For example, another one is the melting pot, that America is a melting pot. That's a myth, and that's not a myth.
Yes, it's kind of a modernist pseudo myth.
Yes.
And it sounds like a good thing until you think it through clearly. It seems to be saying, hey, we'll all just melt together and then it'll be great. We'll coexist. But when you look closely at it, it seems to suggest that the only way to get along is to strip away your language, your religion, and your culture, and like the Borg in Star Trek, and make you just, one of us, which doesn't sound like such a good thing. I mean, shouldn't there be a diversity of perspectives that we can bring to bear? That's what the ancients thought, right? Different people have different arites, and we want to encourage them to develop their arites because then they can bring those gifts back to the culture. The melting pot idea says, no, we should all be the same. We should all melt into one big pot of cheese, or whatever it is that the goo is that we all become. But it seems to explain things. So this is one of the things Kenneth Smith talks about a lot. He tries to systematize insights that Hannah Arendt and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and others have had, but maybe haven't said as directly as they should, which is that you think about in medicine, where at the level of biochemistry, there are a lot of drugs that we use that work because they bind to receptors that were designed to receive something else. But we've found that those receptors are there, and we're able to harness that relationship to give somebody a drug that will help them overcome an illness, because the body, by accident, in being prepared for something else, actually turns out to be prepared to receive the medicine. We talk about how viruses exploit this, how they get to the membrane of a cell and they use the receptors to open it up and inject their own DNA. And so here's a relationship where the one thing is exploiting what was supposed to be a healthful appetite of the cell to take in resources, and it's exploiting it to use it against the cell instead of for the cell's benefit. So what Kenneth talks about is, he says, that's what human beings are like when it comes to our need for culture, our need for myth. We are incomplete animals who have a bunch of instincts missing. And by stripping those instincts out of us, evolution has given us a situation where we're able to replace them with a wide array of different ideas and cultures. So we can become a very adaptable species, able to have an enormous diversity of approaches to life. But he says the downside to that is those receptors, those hungry culture receptors, can be used against us to turn us into consumers who consume and consume and consume against our own interests, generating enormous profits for others, but at the cost of becoming less and less healthy over time. So he says, if for every healthy cultural related thing, you need the concept of its converse. Like for culture, there's also anti-culture. What is something that's created to, instead of making you healthy, it's created in order to make you sick, in order to put you to service instead of help you to be a whole person. And this is the way it is with our receptors for mythos. We have a hunger for profound stories that make sense of the world, but marketing people have learned about that, and they figured out how to make really great advertisements that make us desperate to apply their latest deodorant because now we're terrified we stink. Because we saw the story on TV and, oh my God, that person stank and nobody liked them and we don't want to be that person. So next thing you know, we're shelling out money for all this stuff that maybe we didn't really need and it wasn't healthy for us, but it made a lot of money for somebody. So this is kind of what he's talking about, that the modern myths frequently aren't myths at all. They're occupying our myth receptors, but they're doing it against us instead of for us.
Yes, because sometimes the interpretation of those myths creates conflicts in the society.
Yes. It might lead to the long-term illness of the person or the society rather than to its greater health.
Yes, thank you.
It's a great question, Sharon. Thank you for bringing it up. And it's impossible to talk about the issue of mythos in a modern context without this problem coming up. So we're going to explore it in this book. He's going to explore this a lot over the course of the book, which is why he's got a whole section in chapter 4 that's just introducing the ancient idea of the myth. So I come back again to Gilbert Murray's Rise of the Greek Epic, where he talks about the way that the authors worked and reworked and reworked the Iliad over and over and over, trying to make it stronger and more potent and to teach the lessons that the classical Greeks were so worried needed to be taught, and if they weren't taught, that the Greeks wouldn't succeed. It definitely wasn't a work by some one guy in the distant past that was an oral culture that was eventually written down, but literally it was written down and then rewritten down and rewritten down and edited every time as they were trying to tune it up and tune it up and tune it up to change it from being a story into being a myth. They were trying to make sure that the right lessons came out of it so that they would be healthful lessons and not lessons that made people sicker over time. And they never fully succeeded. As we've talked about here, the great irony of the classical Greeks is the one thing they wanted to avoid above all was what they did with the Peloponnesian War and the subsequent wars that happened. But they were desperately trying not to do that. And their constant editing and retuning of the Iliad and the Odyssey and their other great myths was part of that process of trying to engage in myth making, which sometimes they succeeded at and sometimes they failed at. It's very hard to do. I think it was about a year ago, we were talking about the different character types, and we were getting at Kenneth Smith's idea that the Greeks believed the purpose of an Aristos wasn't just to govern or to be in charge, but to help to craft myths, because it's extremely hard to do. And that if somebody tries to craft a myth who's just utilitarian and selfish, or who's just parochial and self-involved, then the thing that results, we might call it a myth, but it won't be healthy for people. It'll be either exploitative or it'll, in either case, it'll be finitizing instead of infinitizing, and it'll close down thought instead of opening up thought. And this is what the Greeks thought that an Aristos was supposed to do, is work on this problem. But we'll explore this some more. It's a hard problem. Zella, go ahead, come off mute.
Yeah, how's it going? I was going to touch on 2 points, but now that you mentioned character, I just got done reading this book that I bought probably a year ago, and it was on the nature of character and how basically the West, right, including the Greeks and all of that, they just obsessed with character and how do you make it, right? And then what you're talking about is whether it comes about by what the Greek says, right? Character, by force or by inculcation, and how do you imprint that, right? Is one born with it, or does it have to be impressed upon us through myth, through literature, or through what in America was for a very long time the Boy Scouts, which was an early attempt of the Spartans. Let's go up to the woods and let's try to reproduce the Spartan culture, and let's try to create fire and all of that. Did that create manly men? And it turns out that a lot of that fascination in early America was, how do you create men? How do you create citizens? Which was character, right? It was the essence of character. Do you study the Greeks? Do you study the Romans? And that's where the elite schools in America were so fascinated with. You need to study the Greeks. You need to study the Romans, because that's how you get the character. And what we're discovering is that it's more difficult than that. It's a lot more difficult than reading literature, than going to camp and learning how to tie a very good knot that's going to create the character, right? And so we're fascinated with that. And this book touches on that. We're living in an era where we no longer believe you should impose anything on anybody. But we know that historically, when we study the term of character, it's imposition. The word character or inculcation means to literally thrust down with the heel when you're talking about inculcating. And character means an imprint, like a seal. But we live in a society in the West right now where you cannot imprint your worldview on anybody. It has to be depending on every individual's will. And the question, and then I'll touch on the second point, the question is, will that create the character that we strive and then we know better? And right now the book ends with I don't know. Are we going to live in a society of uncharacter types where there is no character types? It's another character of non-character. And it's whoa, that seems to add another character that these ancients never even conceived of, the uncharacter character, where he has nothing written on him, no imprint, but is just smooth, right? What does that look like? And I think in America, we're experimenting. What does the uncharacter character develop in society? And the second point, when you're talking about Erin, I remember reading Jerusalem, her book on the Nazi, right? And it was basically a critique on the idea that if you knew that you were doing evil, that kind of made you incapable of doing evil. Kind of the Socrates idea that someone who knew better, who had the knowledge, the gnosis, would do better, right? If you know what to do, you will do it. And one thing that I recently, I watched this debate with Christopher Hitchens, was that this reform pastor here tells Christopher Hitchens is like a lot of medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, they never took into account that our noetic effect is affected by the fall, right? So your reason is just as corrupted as our bodies decay. And so the noetic effect is affected by sin. And Christopher Hitchens was like, I thought that you guys believe from the Christian tradition that your bodies were fallen, but your noetic aspect of your human nature was not. He was like, no, that was Thomas Aquinas' error, that he believed that reason was this abstracted entity that wasn't affected by sin, but we believe that every part of that was affected by sin. And so hearing Arendt and talking about how Eichmann, who a Nazi, who rationally, who was probably very well known in how to give an accounting, how to organize things, someone that at that level who was very highly cultured could still be evil, just goes to show that just because you know, right, the gnosis, right, it doesn't mean that you're gonna do good. You can actually know what's good and you still choose evil. So I think that's what Arendt was kind of pointing at. Like, we can be knowledgeable, we can be highly cultured, but there's something deeply wrong with us. Culture, society puts pressures, and we still choose evil, like kill people and put them in camps where they're just, you know, treated brutally, even though we know better. I think that's what I get when I hear about Arendt.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And that's definitely, you know, critical to her issues on this, is she's exploring the way in which what we've normalized as what a modern citizen should be like is so weak on character that people will go along with their policies or rules or the group's will or what have you, even if it involves doing some awful things. It takes the development of character to be able to stand against a group. And if your focus, so much of modern societies is on utilitarianism, on getting people to be useful utensils to benefit the society, and part of the way that you end up cultivating people is to have weak characters, because then they'll do what they're told and they won't fight back. And Arendt's line is that what we see in Eichmann is to a large part the end game of modern acculturation, that we are, and she doesn't like to draw this conclusion all the way. Yeah, I'll tell you, she equivocates on this point, but that certainly what we see in him, it results in evil, but it doesn't result in evil through the presence of wickedness, but through a kind of weakness of character, a kind of complacency, a willingness to do what you're told, and so forth, which are many things we deliberately cultivate in people. I mean, she says in an interview, you can see this on bumper stickers and signs. It took me a while to track it down. There's a Hannah Arendt quote: no man has the right to obey. She said it in German originally, and it was in a radio interview. And that theme was developed out of the origins of totalitarianism. And of course, it runs as an unspoken theme throughout Eichmann and Jerusalem. The idea that if you do what people tell you to do, you have to do it because it's right, not because you were told to do it. And that therefore, every citizen has an obligation to critique the orders that they're given and the instruct. They have an obligation to critique the law. Now, the equivalent to this you can see in math classes is bad math teachers tell you to just memorize the equations and follow them. Good math teachers tell you, no, you need to be able to derive this yourself. And you know, I had a great math teacher in high school. He won Teacher of the Year in the United States 2 different years. This is Walla Walla, of all places, Walla Walla, Washington. And it was because his focus was on, do you learn the principles of math that allow you to derive the answers yourself? He would grade you based on your analysis more than on the final. You could get the wrong answer and still get an A if the analysis that led up to that wrong answer was the right analysis. He was more concerned with the quality of your critical thinking, your mathematical capabilities. And so Hannah Arendt is sort of arguing there's some characterological equivalent for a citizen within a society where they need to understand the principles and the values. They need to understand, right and wrong, not as memorized things, but as, principles for constructing a culture. And if they have those things, it will develop in them a character that makes them able to stand against bad laws, bad policies, bad rules, and so forth, bad orders. But if instead you try to raise people to just be, complacent utensils, then you're basically just a hair's breadth away from totalitarianism at all times, because you have a mass population ready to capitulate at a moment's notice, because that's what you taught them to do, to obey. It's fascinating stuff. I'm glad you brought it up, Selig. Sharon, go ahead, and then we'll hit the text.
I read the text before this afternoon, and so the relationship of character to myth and of myth to character. So I want to go back to the text, the paragraph after the one we're reading, the last sentence that says, myth made the Greeks conscious of their own narcotic perspectivisms. It described a logic of the irrational. Like Aesop's fables, it taught the logic of character or perspective or perspectival bias via the specific prerogatives of the gods and defining the traits of humans. That, I thought, was the relationship of the myths of a society to the character of its citizens, which is what I think Zelig was asking.
Yes, I think that's right. It's a great sentence, and it really underscores what the ancients thought the role of myth was. And this kind of storytelling, this kind of myth making, has the ability to create in us a capacity to recognize. And that's an interesting term, because terms like erkennt or erkannt or erkenning that you see in Hegel, translated as to recognize, are the same terms that Hegel himself uses for genothi in genothi seauten. There's a recognition function that's part of gnosis, where part of the way that gnosis works is not just immersing you in the immediate experience, but later on helping you to reconnect to that experience when you're having new experiences that remind you of it. The ability to say, this is like that, and to get it right is ultimately a gnosic function. And because extremely complex subjects like history and culture and character can't be summarized with simple equations or properties or facts, you have to use this recognition faculty of the brain in order to navigate this complex world. And the thing about it is, this complex world of like human characters or human cultures is often the most deterministic. It's the most determining, most important, most essential part of a situation, right? If you're having a discussion with somebody, but by character they're a con man, then if you're paying attention to the exact words they're saying, you're missing everything. What's happening is you're being conned. And it doesn't matter how rational the arguments are or how many facts they're deployed, they're a con artist. And if you know that they're a con artist and you know what they want, then you can reason backwards to figure out why they're making the line of argument they are. And it's part of why when you engage in a debate with somebody who is there in bad faith, who's just trying to win, and they raise a point, and in the course of the debate, you show that that point's not relevant, they don't go, oh, wow, that's really insightful, I'm going to change my mind. What they do is they pivot on a dime and start making some other point, because they didn't actually care about the point they were making. They cared about conning you. They cared about winning. So this is an example of where rationalists, by disregarding the large, complex subject of character that underlies the dialogue, they're actually missing the whole point of what's happening around them. But if you've got an Aesop's fable, it shows you these characters in action, and you see them interacting with each other. You see how one character type will try to abuse another character type. And then in your own life, you may have a shock of recognition when you realize that the situation you're in is just like, the stork and the fox. And you go, oh, I know what's happening. And there was no logical syllogism that could have drawn that conclusion for you. But the gnosic faculty of recognition can, like a bolt of lightning out of a clear sky, can suddenly change your whole understanding of the situation. And if we're going to put it in evolutionary terms, make you more fit to survive, because now you thought that you were having picnic. You were sheep having picnic with another sheep, but it turns out that's not a sheep, that's a tiger. His idea of lunch is you. It's important that you recognize when the partner you're trying to eat with is a tiger who sees you as lunch. These are the sorts of things that myth is for, is to help us to get to the essential points of the situation, which often can't be figured out noetically, can only be figured out by using this other faculty, the mythic gnosic faculty, that has the capacity to infinitize and recognize widespread patterns. So, yeah. All right, go ahead. Oh, Stephen, you had your hand up, but is that your comment in the text that you wanted to make? Yeah. Right. So, all right. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Sharon. I'm glad you brought up the line that you did. Myth made the Greeks conscious of their own narcotic perspectivisms. Notice the use of the word narcotic. He's not just saying, haha, you're a poo-poo head. This isn't an insult. He's saying one of the ways that moderns misunderstand their own minds the most intensely is that we think the mind is a tool, like a computer that we're using to help us calculate information. And the ancients didn't think that the mind worked like that at all. They didn't have, it turns out they did have computers, but as we now know from Yancey Kipthara device, they had calculators, but they didn't see the human mind as merely being some form of calculator. They said, the faculties of the mind are not like hammers and screwdrivers that you just pick up and put down. They're narcotic. We like using the faculties that we use. The better we get at a certain mental faculty, the more we want to use that faculty next time. Each faculty, Hegel talks about this, each faculty rewards you for using it. You get a charge from successfully completing a mathematical calculation or a logical syllogism. You get a charge from correctly figuring out the law and figuring out how to do what you want within the realm of the law. Equally, though, those are noetic things. Equally, though, at a gnosic level, you get a charge out of a powerful experience that you immerse yourself in. The very first time you listen to Brahms' Fourth Symphony with the volume turned up, it's an amazing experience, right? It transports you. You're rewarded for engaging in gnosis. And so there's these feedback loops inside of us that make us crave the use of the faculties. And because gnosis and noesis repel each other, this is why human character types tend to precipitate out of the use of these faculties. And whichever one you tend to lead into, you tend to want to do it more. It has an addictive quality. This is what he's arguing here. And whether you'd call it strictly addictive in the way that cocaine is strictly addictive, we know exactly whether the biochemical tracks are the same, I don't know. But behaviorally, this is what Kenneth is arguing. Behaviorally, people act very much as though they're addicted to their favorite mental faculty. An intellectual prefers to intellectualize. A live for the day, experience everything person prefers to experience. And if you try to get them to do the other thing when they're hell-bent on doing the one they prefer, you get an enormous amount of pushback. They really don't want to stop using the faculty that they're enjoying. So Aesop's fables and myths, he's arguing here, that one of the great powers they have is that they expose for us the liabilities of giving in to that impulse to stick with the one faculty you like. Because we get to see how a human being over time, if they allow themselves to become a prisoner of one of their faculties, they self-caricature until they start to resemble one of these characters from an Aesop's fable. They become not just set in their ways, but turned up to 11. The cranky neighbor who never smiles and always yells at the kids is a trope for a reason. We've all seen this guy. And it's not the same guy. It's just such an easy trap to fall into that everywhere in the world, even cultures that speak different languages and have different religions, they have the cranky old guy who likes to yell at the kids, right? It's a trap, right? This is the Daedalus of the labyrinth. Daedalus is the creator of the labyrinth. The reason he's trapped in it is he made it himself. It's the perfect trap for himself, because in the normal exercise of his creative faculties, the labyrinth is a side effect that he gets trapped into. This is the meta. Speaking of myths, this is a classic myth. This is not a quasi-myth or an anti-myth, but a real myth that's trying to illustrate the ways in which we trap ourselves over time when we get stuck in ruts and start, becoming caricatures of ourselves. So Aesop's fables, they allow us to clearly experience these different character types so that later on in life, which is far more complicated, we can have that charge of recognition when we say, oh my God, now it's the fox and the crow, and the fox is flattering the crow to get the crow to drop the goodie that the fox wants to run off with. And that's what's happening in this business deal I'm trying to make right now. Why is this guy blowing smoke? Why is he buttering me up? Oh, he's the fox and I'm the crow. Uh-oh. Right? This is the point, to short circuit all of the things that could distract us and get us to the point. So that's why he says, like Aesop's fables, it taught the logic of character or perspectival bias. Every perspective is also a bias, right? What is it characteristically, not just what does it characteristically notice, but what does it characteristically not notice? The more, if you don't want to be the victim of a con artist, you can't allow yourself to develop into a caricature, because caricatures always have characteristic blind spots, and con artists are always watching for your character. They're always watching to see which kind of person are you, so that they know which is the way to separate you from your money. All right, let's call on Phil, and then we'll go back to the text. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about myth, but since we delayed it so long, I'm going to let you go on, and then I'll come back to it.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So rolling back to the text again. Let's go back to the sentence we did the first half of, but not the second half of. He said, we talked about myths reveal oblique and difficult truths about human nature. We didn't talk yet about the peculiar warpages that specific appetites and ambitions lay upon human intelligence, right? So each different kind of appetite or ambition, each type of character, each type of strategy for life brings with it, like the con artist watching the punters to figure out what's the right angle to get them with. It brings with it certain stereotypical characteristic ways in which it distorts our thinking. So there's certain kinds of things we'll notice and certain kinds of things we won't notice. This is part of the ancient perspective on the mind, that no human being has pure reason. This is why Heraclitus can say there is a divine logos that deserves to be called a logos. Or in other words, there is a logos in nature that deserves to be called a logos. But what's in human beings, although we call it a logos, we shouldn't, because its finitude means it's self-caricaturing. It blocks itself into distortions inherently in the attempt to map the infinite of the cosmos onto the finite of human reason. And ergo, what fills in the gaps of all the stuff we're missing? Well, it's the irrational side of ourselves that fills in the gaps. It's our subjectivity. It's not possible to be a human intellectual without being heavily driven by your feelings and experiences. It is possible to be a human intellectual and think that you're not doing anything of the sort. In fact, speaking as somebody who grew up as an intellectual, it's almost inevitable that an intellectual believes he has pure reason, and that he's seeing things clearly. And that, sure, he may have emotions, but he's the master of his emotions, and he would never let his emotions interfere with his thinking. This is like a normal prejudicial self-distortion that human reason makes in its understanding of itself. But the ancient perspective is, because we're finite and the universe is infinite, the gaps have to be filled in with something. And since they can't be filled in with any more registers that the human mind is capable of when it's engaging in reason. It's going to fill in the gaps with the unconscious, with the emotional, with the subjective. And ergo, we may correctly reason that E equals MC squared, and so we can build a bomb. But we have a much harder time reasoning about whether or not we should build a bomb, and if so, who should we drop it on? There's this whole other layer in which our emotions are determining for us why we even got into this question to begin with, and how we apply the seemingly objective information that we're working with. Myth's good at this because you read a tragedy and you see Oedipus and he seems to be doing everything right, but next thing you know, everything in his life has come out wrong, and it's unforgettable. And the story makes it so that it's like you've lived through the same experience that Oedipus has in Oedipus Tyrannus. And because you've lived through it, through the drama of the play or the movie or the good book or, whatever experiential form you want, you come out the other side with your gnosis improved. It now can recognize patterns from a life you didn't personally have to experience. And thank God, who wants to experience what Oedipus went through in Oedipus Tyrannus, right? But the lessons to be learned from it are important lessons to help us avoid going through the same thing he went through. So this is the point about myth, that it's what it's designed to do is to give you a prosthesis for your experience that allows you to short circuit the process of growing up and learning, so you don't have to make all the mistakes that the characters in the myths make. This is what he's talking about here. So this is where you become justified in critiquing whether or not what a modern calls a myth is what the ancients would have called a myth, right? We say things like, what do we say? What's an example of a scientific myth that we now know better than? Let's say ether. That light is transmitted through ether. There must be ether present in the universe, and that's the only way that light waves could propagate. This is before the particle model, before Einstein introduced the particle model of the photon, against which there was enormous resistance. We sort of needed the ether because the wave had to propagate through something. So what did the light wave propagate through? Well, now we know it's a myth in the modern sense of the word. We know it's false, but that doesn't tell us anything about human character or human ambition, or how we're supposed to interact with the infinitudes of life. It's only a myth in a modern sense, in a dismissive, it's obsolete. It's a superstition. It's not correct sense. But what happened to Oedipus, that's not a superstition. It's not a falsehood. It's not an old primitive version of a new modern theory. It remains as valid today as it ever was. That if we're not careful, our very strengths will be the things that become our undoing. When Nietzsche says power makes stupid, this is part of what he's alluding to. A lot of us think the only thing that's wrong with our lives is we don't have enough money or power. If we could just get more money or power, we could solve all our problems. But Nietzsche says, have you even read Oedipus Tyrannus? I mean, he was the king. He had all the power. And it didn't work. In fact, his life would have gone so much better with less power if he'd stayed in the hills with his adopted parents, who he thought were his real parents, herding sheep. None of the calamities in his life would have happened. It was his attempt to avoid his fate by gaining more power that created the possibility of making all these terrible mistakes. And so it is with a lot of the petards upon which we are hoist in the modern world. Many of them are of our own creation. And we didn't create them so that we could cause those problems. We created them to solve other problems. But being finite rationalists, we couldn't fully think through the implications of what was happening. And so we didn't know the way in which we were laying landmines in our own path. All right, so that's that sentence. So let's go back to Phil then, and I'll pull up the next sentence while you're talking.
Yeah, I want to talk about myth because I think I was impressed with what Steve said about the Wizard of Oz. Very good. It helped me understand the Wizard of Oz even better. I like the Wizard of Oz. Is one of my top movies. But I'll mention the other movie that I like even a little bit better, which is High Noon. I'll try to tie it together. Like, it's interesting because The Wizard of Oz was both a very deep movie, but it was also a very popular movie. Sort of had it both ways. I mean, it starts out with Dorothy thinking, someday she has a dream someday, things will come true and all that, right? So the whole thing was about dreaming, which is interesting, And so there was, I suppose, a tornado. Kansas had many tornadoes, and the house blew away, and then it landed somewhere, and then there was a yellow brick road, followed the dream. And I like the fact that the three characters, which are the anti-characters in a way, that was traveling with her. I mean, at least incomplete characters. And they met many, many instances, and then they finally got to the Wizard of Oz, right? Who was the great magician, sort of a demigod, so to speak, that would set everything straight. And then when they pull back the curtain, they realized this was all a myth in the modern sense, not the myth in the old-fashioned sense, right?
It's a con.
Yeah, it's a con, right? It's a myth in that sense. So it's only what's interesting was that it was, in a sense, a myth that criticized the myth. It was deconstructing it in a funny way. Okay. And so finally, I guess the thing terminated, and she ended up finding out that this was all a dream to begin with. So the dream was, someday over the rainbow, things will come true. And then what she found out was, like, after she woke up from the dream, she realized all the characters that was in the dream was characters that were her neighbors, right? And she came back and she realized, in the dream, their weaknesses, but they were friends for her. And she came back and realized, being in Kansas is not so bad after all, which is interesting. Now, it's interesting they picked the state of Kansas, partly maybe because what tornadoes are and all that kind of stuff. Kansas is where John Brown's body was smoldering in his grave, which is interesting, pointing out something that's interesting. Kansas is also where Wyatt Earp started his career, the cowboy that's going to clean up the West in Tombstone and all that, okay? Because in America, it was a frontier that you have to have brute force because it was lawless before you could have civilization. That was the myth of the cowboys. And we all loved the cowboy movies at one time, right? But that was already, in a sense, deconstructing, because it says, in the final analysis, the gun speaks louder than the words. In a lawless land, the gun is the law, which is interesting. Now, then I'm going to flash back to how that relates to the fact that, we had a greater myth in America, which is manifest destiny. It was destined by God that we, from sea to shining sea, right? And in some sense, this was inevitable. And the damn Indians, by the way, I don't mean that, but I'll just use that as a quote, was standing in the way of our destiny. How dare those people, right, do that, right? And that was supplemented by what is the guy, the guy who said, oh, this is justified because the American Indians, yeah, they live in the land, they live off the land, but they never owned the land. They have no concept of property rights. So that was a tactical move in relationship to this great myth of your manifest destiny that was necessary. That's another myth. a tactical myth that, in a sense, law would come in a land of, maybe I shouldn't say lawlessness, but the lack of law, and we will distribute it. And of course, Kansas was the place where, no, it was Oklahoma, which is sort of the next state. What there was the free land claim that you went. So that was it. So all this is wrapped up in interesting. So the cowboy movies, cowboys in general, was a mythic representation of the, how should I say, a kind of the manifestation of American exceptionalism that we still hold. But High Noon came along, and High Noon deconstructed the cowboy myth. Very, very interesting that within the movie, High Noon, I wouldn't call High Noon a popular culture thing, was Wizard of Oz was. High Noon was a kind of an anti-myth that was taken down, right? Here is the community that supported the marshal who is bringing the law to the land, but when the crunch come down, they didn't back him, right? And I remember the scene where he, after cleaning the town up the last time, he just threw his badge to the ground.
Yeah.
Yep. No, the cowboy isn't the thing, you know? It's fine. America finally grew out of the cowboy movies, although we still love the cowboy movies to a certain degree because it manifests a kind of virtue in a way. So in some sense, you know, it's kind of interesting. The cowboy movies didn't have the same punch after that, you know? They still made it, but it didn't have the same kind of punches back in the 30s and the 40s. So High Noon was a very moment in which the myth was able to criticize itself. Right? And I want to bring in another thought, you know, like, I know you all praise Hegel, and I myself do too. In Hegel's thing, I guess he would not have negated American Indians, right? What he did was he sublated them. In other words, they weren't left out, but they were just put to the sideline, you know? You just go be the water boys or whatever, you know? And I kept asking, the reason why I asked this question is, and I told this before, you know, in 1970, maybe 73, 74, I used to work as the how should I say, the photographer, sort of an adjunct photographer at the Lower Museum of Anthropology. I fell in love, by the way, with American Indian art, so particularly from the Plains Indians. It's very beautiful. And I remember one day I walked in, because it's got a great collection of American Indian art, as well as other so-called primitive artifacts from Africa and so forth, Oceania. And one day I walked in and I passed the preparation room, and there was a bunch of people that looked like American Indians. They weren't wearing headdresses, so I wasn't sure, but they looked like American Indians, and they were sitting there. I think they were seeing a lecture or whatever they were. And so I didn't know what in the hell are they doing in the Lower Museum of Anthropology, right? And I did my work, and then later on, the guy who was heading the seminar, whatever it was, came in, and I had some photographs for one of his books, so we were familiar with each other to a certain degree. And I said, what's with the thing you did with, I believe, the American Indians? He said, oh, I am teaching them basket weaving. Oh my God, it suddenly occurred to me, these people have been sublated to the point they did not know who they were. They absolutely did. And this was at the same time that Dennis Banks and Wounded Knee was having the American Indian movement, you know, and Governor Brown refused to extradite them. Eventually he had to, because of state law or whatever. So how on earth, when the American Indian was beginning to collect a kind of consciousness that I guess the American Indians in California were beginning to understand it, and they have to learn the culture, not from an artisan, not from their culture, because they don't know who they were. They have to learn it from an anthropologist.
Mhm.
Oh, that is sublation.
Mhm.
That degree of sublation, I wonder, is strangling a culture kind of a kind of a gentle kind of killing? That let's just hang them. So I'm not so sure if sublation, we could allow people off the hook. Oh no, we didn't negate them. We just sort of sublated them and strangled them until they no longer knew who the hell they were. So I have my criticism about sublation as well.
Yeah.
So, which once again is that, you know, it's a criticism of a myth in a way. So I thought I'd say that. Thank you, Steve, for you know, firing up my my thoughts about the Wizard of Oz. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so much good material there, and I'm just going to skate right past it because I think you've said it all. And it's other than to say, God, I love High Noon. What a great film. It has a lot of mythic quality to it. So what I am going to do is do the next bit of the text, where Kenneth Smith says, myths are maps of the covert currents of the implicit world, the subjective forces to which human beings are liable. And so, you know, in this, notice his reference to liability and implicitness. He's talking about the way in which the focus of gnosis is on life as a pathos, as something that you experience, something that happens to you, rather than life as being willful, the product of your own decisions. And this is the split between gnosis and noesis. The optimization of gnosis, the great strength of gnosis is that life happens to us and we don't ignore what's happening, but we immerse ourselves in it so that we are finely, keenly attuned to the textures and qualities of that life. And that the only way to get that level of recognition is to be willing to be the passive object of the world and let the world be the subject. The extent to which we refuse, the extent to which we say, well, I don't want to experience life on its terms, I insist on imposing my own terms. Hegel's critique with negation is that's the extent to which we start losing track of the actual textures and patterns of life, because we're distancing ourselves from them in order to create a space for our own will and our noesis. So, you know, the great, you know, when you see E equals MC squared, it's telling you, you know, how to harness that energy and how much energy you can expect to harness. It's describing these relationships in a utilitarian fashion. It doesn't say anything about what you should do or about, you know, what human nature is like and its liabilities. It's just describing things that can be useful. And it's describing them specifically in a way so that they will be useful. This is Paul Feyerabend writes about this a lot, and Kenneth Smith cites this too. That the way that moderns engage in science is to produce as many scientific hammers as possible, as many different handles on the world as possible. You can find scientific works that have normative value, that try to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, but they're by far the minority. Most scientific works in a modern sense are trying to give you a utilitarian truths. But myths aren't useful that way. It's part of why they've been sidelined out of the modern world. They might be useful as something to sell to the masses for money. So, you know, the most discussion of myths that you find is usually in screenwriting, right? Or authors of novels, people who look to make money by doing it. But you're not going to find a lot of it in the structure of the law or in the structure of the economy. You look at the financial officer's balance sheets, you're not going to find references to myths in there. The last thing in the world that a financial officer wants on his balance sheets is anything normative talking about right and wrong and whether you should do these things. The whole point is to evacuate that and to allow pure mathematical calculation of the, pros and cons in the sense of, how much money would we make, what would our costs be, and so forth. So mythos reasoning, by being gnosic, by being immersive, it sets itself up to be more able to explain the things that human beings are subject to, because when you're subject to things, then life is a pathos. They're happening to you. That's the specialty of gnosis. What is it that happens to us? And it's not just what happens to us from without, the world around us, as Heraclitus says, but also what happens to us from within, because of the undiscovered parts of ourselves that erupt forth when we don't expect it. I was talking with a close relative who's having some relationship difficulties, and was talking about how it's one of the things that modern psychiatry increasingly recognizes, is that one of the great challenges of having a close, intimate relationship is that when people feel safe, parts of themselves they'd long forgotten or maybe even never knew were there start erupting out. Things that they would never bring out in public where they don't feel safe start to they start to act out in ways that they didn't know were part of themselves. And it can be as much a surprise to the person acting out as to the person that it's happening to. And it happens because we don't know ourselves, right? But also because to be immersed in life and subject to it is also to be subject to things arising from within that we were unaware of. So this goes back to Joseph's question about the conscious and the unconscious from earlier in this call. Is like, this is why this is Gnosis's strength, is because Gnosis doesn't try to say a lot in advance about how things, are going to be made or what exactly is going to happen, but it tries to give us the actual texture of life as it's experienced, so that when things are happening, we are inclined to recognize it and acknowledge it and not suppress it, right? You can think about this like if you're trying to solve a math problem with the window open while a bird's outside singing. You can either pay close attention to the quality of the bird's song, or you can pay close attention to your math problem, but it's excruciatingly difficult to do both at the same time. The act of intellectual engagement, the willfulness involved in harnessing the rules of math to get this thing to come out right, it subtracts from how much of you is being subject to the experience of the world around you. There's a give and take between the two. So, myth. And this idea of myth as a map is critical too, right? So, as complicated as the surface of the world is, as much as I appreciate the work of cartographers, as much as I appreciate the way in which, in some sense, the actual length of the coastline of Norway may not be infinite, but it's a lot bigger than it looks on a map because of all the little crinkly bits, right? Not just the fjords, but the little fjords within the fjords and the micro fjords within those fjords. It's very complicated, but it's still a massively simpler problem because you're just trying to translate a physical object. The moment you get into character and history and culture, you're dealing with things that are not restricted by the law that two things can't occupy the same space. The important parts of your character and the important parts of your culture can totally interpenetrate each other, so that you can have a ridiculous number of things going on at the same time that all matter, at a level that you don't normally experience when you're dealing with just trying to map physical objects. And this is part of why you can't map the covert currents of the implicit world and the subjective forces of your own psyche as easily as you could map the coast of Washington. As hard as it is to map the coast of Washington, which I fully appreciate as a hiker and a camper, I totally get how hard it is, but it's vastly easier than to try to map out, let's say, Eric's psychology. What is Eric's life experience? What has all happened to him? What are the meaningful parts of his life? What are the things that he's conscious of or not conscious of? What's going to come erupting out unexpectedly? And what things are not, because he spent the time to learn about them and he knows these are his tendencies and what he's liable to do. Eric's a far more complicated subject than the map of Washington. This is what that Heraclitus quote is saying. There is a kind of infinitude inside of ourselves. So you can't map it the same way that you map the sorts of things that we think of when we think of mapping. And it's why mythos has this particular power. It has this ability to represent otherwise unmappable infinities into something that not only is a representation, but a representation that has emotive normative force that allows us to remember it and get back to it later when we most need it. Like when we're in the middle of being conned and we go, hey, I don't think you're my friend. Thank goodness for those stories that helped us to clue into what it's like to be conned so that we don't have to actually have been conned in order to recognize it when it's happening. Stephen, then Phil, then Zella. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'll just bring up the concepts around the original Wizard of Oz. It was about the expansion into the West of new territories. They had the rail lines, and what that meant is that everybody could race out there and massively expand the farming program, and the banks lent money for this. And of course, what happened is they all produced, and the price of their produce fell on the market over the decades. And so they found that their ability to produce didn't equal the debt they had created. And the Wizard of Oz was dealing with the political problems. The Scarecrow represented the farmers. The Tin Man represented the industrial workers that had been thrown out of work in the 90s depression. So yeah, your industrial worker tends a machine all day. He becomes a heartless robot. And the Cowardly Lion represented the politicians who, like the sheriff in High Noon, their role was to stand up to the banks and say, no, you can't do this. So yeah, it's about the question between silver and gold currency, I think, because they went on the gold standard. They demonetarized silver, which meant the farmers' capacity to pay back with silver was curtailed. We want gold now, silver's no good. If people want to look up the original meaning, check it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's layers and layers to this. It's everything's connected to everything else. It's part of what's interesting about the world. And it's part of why in his classes that he used to teach in person at university, Kenneth used to say, it almost doesn't matter where we begin the discussion. We might as well start with whatever's on people's minds, because we'll get to where we need to go because everything's connected to everything else. It's not that hard. This, questions of determinism or existentialism or transcendentalism or what have you are always just a little turn away from whatever we're talking about at the moment. Phil and then Zella. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I guess we're struggling between the conceptual world and the existential world of existence. I remember this. This is another incident that happened to me at Berkeley. I love Berkeley because I sort of much of my maturation came out at Berkeley. The Spa Plaza is the plaza between Telegraph Avenue, it ends, and you go into the campus, and then there's a gate that enters the rest of the campus. So Spa Plaza is essentially the agora of Berkeley, where all the demonstrations happen and all the relationship between the university and the public happen in a very revolutionary period, and People's Park wasn't too far away. So I used to love spending some time in Spa Plaza. And one time, I actually went into Spa Hall to go to the restroom. And probably because I had some business, I forgot exactly why I was there. But so Spa Hall was on one side, on the northern side of Sproul Plaza, and then the southern side was the Student Union. So that was also the center in terms of the university. I might have been upstairs. I went, and when in the stall, when I sat down and did my business, I saw a graffiti. It was a very interesting graffiti. It just said, there was 3 lines. It says Aristotle, and then I guess a colon, and to do is to be. No, to do is to be, that's right. Okay. The next line, Sartre. To be is the do. The third line, Sinatra. Do, be, do, be, do. And I said to myself, damn, what a clever little graffiti, you know? I mean, even though there was the last one, there was a certain amount of irony in the whole thing, but nonetheless, like,
Yes.
and I told that to my brother, and my brother is much keener than I in terms of like publicity, and he wrote to the San Francisco Examiner about that, although he didn't experience it. He probably claimed that he did, and it was published. That was interesting, you know, about how there was this graffiti in the bathroom door, doobie doobie doo. Frank Sinatra, the great 20th century philosopher.
Right.
And I remember, it didn't affect me immediately, but I except for the fact that I thought this is really, really a deep comment in its way. But later on, I realized, oh, I really appreciate it, and I really had a full understanding of Jackson Pollock, because it's about being and doing, not necessarily between being and thinking. And so, like, action painting was capturing the exact moment of the action of doing. And if you do not understand that, then in a sense, no wonder you believe, oh, it's a bunch of childish drip. This is like the drip cloth, you know, the painters use, you know. Actually, maybe that's not such a far stretch, because the drip cloth is also doing. The incidental, you know, trace marks of action in the world. Being in the world is not only about thinking about the world, but about doing. Doing is about existence. So, doobie doobie doo, Jackson Pollock. That's all I want to say. That's a very, very important moment in my life.
Thank you, Phil. I first heard that line in chemistry class in high school at Walla Walla High School. My chemistry teacher used to run all 3 of those lines together. It wasn't till years later I saw the 3-part attribution to Aristotle and Sartre and Sinatra. To be is to do is to be, doobie doobie doo. Zelig, go ahead. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Going to that, to the point related to that, you mentioning how we're really uncontrollable, and it makes me think of Wittgenstein's view on language, that it's not meant to try to read our minds, because we just can't. You can't go into someone else's psychology and kind of see it like, you know, you would see a tree, rocks, or, you know, earth. So language was invented as a shared community, sort of a map, so that we can understand each other, translate each other's to one another. And it's interesting because it goes back to what is language, right? It's characters. it's again that idea of imprinting, so that we can understand each other. And it makes me think of today, like, where we no longer believe in such a thing of imprinting upon people, anything. Then we no longer believe in having conversations, and it's obvious, like in our public spaces, when we hear differing opinions, they completely get shut down or canceled, right? That's kind of like a thing what happened with Twitter when Elon Musk bought the company, there was this idea that like, okay, so for a very long time, these Twitter files that were released recently showed us that the government was working with a private company to shadow ban or to deactivate people that were offensive, right? They were saying things that were unsavory. But the question is, even though they're unsavory, do we still allow these people to put these characters out there so that they can make an impression on us, and then we decide whether those impressions, we either go deeper and imprint those in our cultivations, or we believe that there should be no discussion of anything that might impress upon us something that we disagree with. And thinking of like the state that we're in, we are very like, we do not believe in characters. Like we don't believe that. We sincerely believe that we're tabula rasa, like what John Locke talked about, a blank slate. And anything that makes an imprint on us is deemed to be a violation of our rights. And so the question is, because we know the human mind cannot be captured like a mathematical equation or like a very finite point in a Cartesian grid, we created culture, right? We created these imprints, these languages, to say, okay, within these imprints that we know what they mean, we're going to imprint you so that we can know what's inside of you, at least with the probability, not an absoluteness, but we know that if you dress like this, speak English or speak Mandarin or speak Spanish, we know that you might understand us, not necessarily because, language is itself ambiguous, but at least there's a high probability that you might be participating in our society trying to do good. But we no longer believe that. And so everyone's suspicious of everyone, where we're basically like cables that are without any, it takes me back to electricity, that the reason that we put, these plastics over it, insulated, is so that the dynamics of electricity doesn't go out and shock us. And it's like, no, it's like we're walking like just naked wires. And we might it makes us think like, am I going to offend you if I say something? You know what I mean? Because I don't even know what language you're speaking. Yeah, we're speaking English, but we don't belong to the same culture anymore. And I think that's the state in America. We're kind of walking naked wires, and like any interaction we have with each other, it's like bzz, canceled. and so you're like, you know what? I'm just gonna stay in my little circle, and I'm just not gonna think about Greek culture, because Greek culture is being canceled right now because it promoted slavery, or it talked about slavery or about women in a certain way. So I'm not gonna promote classical literature. So you have many professors and many philosophy departments in America who are no longer receiving funding because it's just perpetuating, what they would call white supremacy. And it's like, well, you can't interpret the Greeks according to our views. Like, let them speak. And it's like, no. And so that's it makes me think of all of that. Like, man, like we're moving to something else, whatever that is. I don't know what it is. I don't know what we're moving to, but we're moving into a different culture, different generation, where it's like we can't even talk to each other anymore. That's what I'm seeing when you go out into the public and you can't say certain things because you might trigger somebody, and then you might offend them. So that kind of makes me think of the uncharacter aspect of what we're watching and the volatility of human nature.
Thanks, Oleg. Yeah, there's sort of a fundamental issue with modernity and culture that some earlier writers have talked about, that has to do with, just because we call what we have a culture, does that make it one? Can we just have a vote and say it's a culture because we said so? Or are there certain things a culture has to be able to accomplish before it counts as a culture? And if ours doesn't accomplish those things, is it something other than a culture? Kenneth Smith calls it an anti-culture. He says, it uses the receptors that human beings have for culture, our need for culture, but then uses it against us. in order to generate short-term economic value, and that has nothing to do with what's good for us or what's healthy for us, or even what's good or healthy for the civilization as a whole. That there's been a sort of weaponization of our need for culture, and that the result is that what modernity has been calling a culture and presenting as though it's a coherent civilization never was, and was always not long for this world. And now that it's incurring the liabilities of that's making things difficult, it's shocked to discover that things don't work so well. And every 10 years or so, it renames the culprit, the scapegoat that is the cause of why things don't work well anymore in our culture, whether it's political correctness or cancel culture. Every generation, they've got something new to call it. But all of these things are stalking horses. They're all irrelevant. The real fundamental problem is modernity never agreed to have a culture in the first place. The Greeks, when they set out to have a culture, they were trying to solve a specific problem very deliberately. And they may or may not have done it well, but they at least knew what it was they were trying to do. And they could say, when are we improving our culture, its healthiness and so forth, and when are we making it sicker? But we never agreed on anything like that. We just said from day to day, we'll just have a vote and see what happens. And the consequence of that is what Aristotle wrote about in the Politics. What you get by doing that is you get one of the worst of all possible forms of governments, where, yes, you get people voting and things happen based on the vote, but nobody ever agreed on why they were voting or what the point of any of this was. And so the civilization just sort of lurches in one direction after another, sort of aimlessly. And frequently it doesn't lurch anywhere at all because its energies are all canceling themselves out internally. Somebody's a peak while somebody else is a trough, and now we don't go anywhere. So there's an incoherency at the root of the modernist approach to civilization, which to an ancient, whether Greek or otherwise, would have seemed obvious, but to us, it's hardly expressible at all what the problem is. So, kind of going back to this question of mythos, if we go back to the text, his next sentence here is: emotions and passions are ultimately manias or states of possession, in which human beings lose their customary powers of self-rule. So there's a lot of things tied up in this. And it's possible to misread this very easily. The modern would tend to misread this. So I'm going to try to pull this apart a little bit. First of all, let's look at the idea of state of possession and think about this in a medieval Orthodox Christian sense. And I don't mean Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. I mean the dominant orthodoxy of the medieval religion. What possesses you? A demon, right? A demon possesses you. And a demon is a medieval reinterpretation of an ancient daemon. So we're back to ethos anthropoi daimon by Heraclitus, right? Character is fate. And the idea was that your daimon rules over your unconscious and your feelings, and it's controlling what you notice or don't notice, what you want or don't want. That, in other words, to have a character is to be in a state of possession, in which rather than you possessing the character, your character possesses you. That's what Heraclitus is saying when he says the daimon, it's like a god that rules over you, and the domain of that god is you. And it's ruling over you. And if you want to have any free will, you better learn about your daimon and cultivate it in a healthier direction. And that's where your scope for free will is. That if you know yourself and cultivate yourself, you can change your daimon over time into a better direction. And now you have exerted some control over your fate. So by changing what your daimon wants. So along comes early Christianity, and the early form of Christianity is, you can see a lot of this in Paul. There's a lot of promising to cast out demons, which is a kind of proto-medieval interpretation of a daimon. And the argument is, if you have a bad character, if you're dysdaimoniac, you're ruled by a bad daimon that keeps drawing you to make terrible mistakes in your life, all is not lost, says the early Christians. You can let Jesus drive out your bad daimon, and now if you have faith in Jesus, Jesus can be your daimon. You can be ruled by him, and he has a great character. In fact, he has a character that includes the divine. It's not simply restricted to the human. It's human and divine at the same time. And so all of those limitations you can't get over with a mortal natural daimon, you can get over by driving out your daimon and replacing it with the one shared daimon of Jesus, who's going to bring you God as your ruling principle. And by the time you get into the medieval period, this has changed. The subtleties of this have been lost by the time you get into the medieval epoch, and it has been replaced with this idea of demons are always running around trying to possess people. And you want, if they possess you, then you want things that you don't want, and you do things you don't want to do, and so what you need is somebody to get rid of that so you can go back to being yourself. So this is different from saying I want to get rid of myself and put God in charge, which was the original proposition. This is saying, oh no, you want to go back to being yourself, but you want to get rid of this intruder who has butted in. So if he's talking here about this is a really interesting change over time. So if he's talking about here as emotions and passions being manias or states of possession, he's talking about this sense in which you lose yourself. That's why he uses that phrase, lose their customary powers of self-rule, right? Just as though we're instead of living our life, we're living in the film The Exorcist, and the devil, or a bunch of demons have possessed us, and we've lost our own control over ourselves, and now we're being controlled by something else. This model, this metaphor he's doing here is this describing of, an emotion or a passion can take you over so that you don't do the things you would normally do, but you instead do the things that passion or emotion wants you to do. Now, you can see how this could lend itself to the intellectual noetic terror of emotions that says, oh God, I have to keep my feelings on a leash because otherwise, God knows what I'll do. Those scary, scary feelings. I can't have any feelings. I must be a pure creature of reason who will be in perfect control of himself at all times. So there's ways to read this that play into kind of modern misinterpretations that Kenneth definitely doesn't mean that. But he's talking here about the question of character. And when he says self-rule, the Greek for self-rule is autarkia. And self-rule or or autonomia, setting your own, the ancients see as being one of the defining characteristics of an organism, right? It rains on a rock. The rock has no autarkia, so it just sits there and gets rained on. It can't do anything about it. But it rains on a cat. The cat has powers of autarkia. It can say, I don't care for this. I'm going to go somewhere warm and dry, right? It can rule itself. And the advantage of autarkia is supposed to be that you can improve, your health and your survivability and so on by having an active role to play in guiding your fate, by intervening in what would have happened to you to make something else happen instead. But the Greeks understood this idea of people being overtaken by these passions or manias. If you read the Iliad, frequently Homer uses the language of a god intervening in what somebody would have done, right? To get them to not notice something they should have noticed, or to be obsessed with something they shouldn't have been obsessed with. Hell, Aphrodite's whole job as a goddess is the work of manias. It's to constantly intervene in what it was you thought you were going to doing, like a moth to a flame. There's Paris thought that he was going, in Greece, he thought he was going to have a meeting, and next thing you know, he's falling in love with Helen, and they make explicit, that's Aphrodite's son doing that to him, intervening as a mania to drive him out of his good sense. So far that it leads to the destruction of, Bronze Age civilization, but hey, he didn't know at the time that was going to happen. So then Kenneth continues, myths tell the naive about the ways of those fantastic and obscure inner teleologies that comprise human nature. In other words, the myths want to give us, like Aesop's fables, they want to give us examples of the ways in which people can be diverted from what they would have done when they're under the influence of an emotion or a passion, or really, he says emotions and passions, but really he means any other part of your character that is unknown to you and that is potent, that's powerful, that it, your character possesses you effectively and drives you this way and that. And those drives are the teleologies, right? So Oedipus's determination to control his fate is what causes his fate. If his character wasn't wired that way, no tragedy would have happened to him. This is the relationship he's talking about here. And these sorts of things are very hard to explain to people. Human languages don't lend themselves. Certainly mathematics and logic don't lend themselves to giving you crisp, clear, predictable explanations of, this is what you're going to do on this day, and then the next day you'll do that. None of that stuff maps human behavior very well at all. But this idea of different competing passions within us that show up at certain characteristic times that make us, like I have a friend whose child was obsessed with Pokemon, and you could predict 100% of the time that whatever it was you were talking about together, if Pokemon or anything vaguely resembling Pokemon in any way was anywhere nearby, the conversation was about to lurch in that direction, because, this child could not stop themselves from going, oh my God, Pokemon, let me tell you all about the Pokemon. It's like, well, we were talking about what to have for dinner, but, next thing we know, it's Pokemon again. Why? Because of this person's character, right? The manias within them are waiting to erupt when they get their opportunity, and they're watching for their opportunity that says, now is my moment. I must tell you all about Charmander. This is the time has come. The argument from the ancients is that it may sound more grown up when people get excited about fiscal responsibility or freedom or military intervention, but when you take off the grown-up clothes of the language, ultimately it's the same kind of character-driven manias that underlie our apparently rational discussions and decisions. And to the ancients, that's easy to explain. They give you the myths. Here you go, here's examples. But to moderns who believe that myths are lies, it's almost impossible to explain, because we believe that it is our birthright to be infinitely free and have free will, thereby erasing the whole problem that the ancients thought were the biggest problem facing human beings. We just define it away. Oh no, we're free. The end. It's a thought-terminating cliche. No need to struggle to develop your character. No need to struggle to figure out who you are. You're a modern, right? Just like Jesus was going to drive out your bad character and help you to be a better person, we offer an even better deal. You don't have to do any work at all. By being a modern, you are inherently free. The end. Nothing to struggle for. And from an ancient perspective, that would mean that we're all slaves because we never did the work to try to free ourselves from the strictures of our character. Because we believed we're free, we made ourselves into slaves, would be the ancient perspective on what it means to be a modern citizen. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Now I'm wondering whether I'm suffering from the mania. Because I'm going to bring up mediation again, okay? Because it seems like myth and fables, and in fact the oracles, in fact even the gods, are a way of mediating our passions in some sense, right? By allowing something to, in a sense, stand in the place, and we could, in a sense, interpret that. So what do you think if I decide, instead of going to the oracles at Delphi, I just go to a Chinese restaurant? And now this particular oracle never occurred to me, but I heard about it. And of course I went there not for the Chinese meal, although I enjoy Chinese meal, but
You want the fortune cookie?
So the fortune cookie, right? That's my mediation. And what if I got the fortune that says, disregard all previous fortune cookies? I mean, isn't that mediation warning you? Be careful about mediation.
Yes.
Because there could also be a lie within that as well, right? I mean, I wish I had that fortune cookie I actually probably would have framed it because it just seemed like such a, I say, how to say, reflexive mediation about mediation itself, kind of like high noon in a way, right? So just be careful. You got to keep in mind, disregard all previous fortune cookies, because hidden within it is not necessarily just the truth, but also a possible lie. It's a double-edged sword. So that's what I'm going to say.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I am the great and powerful Oz. Yes. Now, this is all those other fortune cookie fortunes. They were lying to you. I'm the real fortune cookie fortune. You trust me. I've got your back. Zealot, go ahead.
It makes me think of what are the suspicions we have of people who say they have character, and then all you have to do is just sit down and wait, and you realize that they have none, like Bill Clinton. The book on character mentions how, I think it was a year before, he was talking about how young Americans needed to cultivate charity, community work, so that they can be good citizens. And then a year later, he was found to be lying before Congress under oath. And it makes us think, like, can character change? Is it malleable? And when you mention Jesus, it makes me think of the story where he tells a Pharisee, he tells Nicodemus, it's a famous story, where he says, you must be born again. And Nicodemus says, what do you mean, Lord? You mean go back to my mother's womb? And he says, and it's a common Jewish trope, because you read the Old Testament prophets and it says that Yahweh would have to remove your heart of stone and give you one of flesh so that you can obey his commandments. And so from the Judeo-Christian perspective, human beings cannot change their character, that there's something that because you're a creation, you do not have the keys to change your nature. And I think in modern science, we also do believe that, like, how do we get rid of addiction, right? Someone that has fallen into the traps of fentanyl, how do you get rid of it? And modern science is saying, well, we're going to have to do something with epigenetics so that, the 99% of the relapses that happen who consume fentanyl or heroin doesn't happen anymore, by erasing the memory of what it felt like to get the first head rush of your heroin or your fentanyl dose. And so even in modern science, we believe that the only way that you change your character, your addictive character, is through biological means. Erasing that neuron that makes you remind yourself of how good it feels. And so most of these addicted people always fall in relapse because they can remind themselves. Your brain is like, hey, it feels so good, remember that? And it's just beating you. And so you have me going to McDonald's, very late, because it felt so good. My brain is telling me, like, hey, remember that? Yeah, but it ain't good for me. Well, remember. And so science is saying, when we can figure out how to erase your memory of that first bite of that juicy burger you had in your life, you're going to be able to overcome your addictive behavior. And so in the Christian worldview, it's like, since you're a created being, only your creator can change your character. And in the Greek world, since virtue is something that you make yourself, then it makes sense as to why they believe that they can control what they are. And then in the modern world that we're living in, it was like, we're just creatures of chemicals. And so the only way that we can change our character is if we pop pills or erase our memories with epigenetics. And so it all goes back to, as what do we see ourselves, the product of a God, of our own selves, or of matter in motion, right, from the scientific perspective?
Hey, Selig, I have to intervene and defend President Clinton, because it all depends on the meaning of what the meaning of is. That's my
Enter Parmenides. Excuse me. Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
I just want to add a little clarity to this. Addictive behavior is almost entirely physiological. Cognitive character is cognitive, and it takes hard work. Addictive behavior is like having diabetes. The science has found that out now. And that's why it's so difficult to impact. But changing your character is a thought-provoking process, or a thought regenerating, or a thought modification process. And it's easy to confuse the two.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, what happens with drug addiction is in many ways a much simpler, even though it's powerful, it's a much simpler phenomenon than what happens with the way that we become addicted to our characters' predispositions. Yes. That's a really complicated subject. Very hard to discuss clearly, but this issue of character is going to come up over and over throughout this book, because I've sort of hinted here at some of the ways in which the medieval conception of human character is different. Zelig alluded to some of it too. There's going to be some pushback in the medieval epoch against the ancients to say, is it arrogant to claim that we can change our own character? Is it arrogant to claim that we can help ourselves, or should we just throw ourselves on the mercy of God? These become major theological issues throughout the medieval period. And of course, the progress that's made against the ancient perspective during the medieval epoch starts to work against us in the modern epoch when we chuck out God. And now what are we left with? Do we even have a character at all? Does humanity have any significance? Can modernity understand human beings as being something other than a mere resource? This becomes a problem. So we got a little bit more time, so I thought I'd take us through the rest of this paragraph, because the opening of the paragraph really sets up the end of it. He says, the characters in myth, and now he's not talking about human character per se, although he's making a little pun here. He's saying the characters who are the characters within the myth are also representations of character, effectively, which is the pun he's making. And he's saying each of them names some urge or liability which a prudent human being will have to learn how to navigate around. Now, this should ring a lot of bells for people who remember the discussion of ancient polytheism. Mm-hmm. That, in ancient polytheism, the purpose of the divinities was not anything like the purpose of the medieval divinity. It wasn't about abasing yourself before an all-powerful, all-knowing, compassionate God who was going to, shepherd you to a good plan. The ancient divinities were anthropomorphizations of aspects of nature that we needed to keep an eye on because they had authority over us, whether it was good authority or bad authority, whether it was, for our own good or to grind us underfoot. It's a completely different question to the ancients than it is to the medievals. So here we have the character, not just the deities in the myth, but the characters in the myth are also being used to catalog things that we ought to know about. But in this case, it's not the case. Like if you were to be to respect Aphrodite from an ancient perspective, it means to respect the dangers of attraction and beauty, and it's the power, the sway it has over us. But if you are to learn about Oedipus, it's not because Oedipus himself is a deity who has sway over you, but as a paradigm, as an example of what will happen to you if you don't heed the lessons that Oedipus didn't heed. So this is a second kind of catalog that goes alongside the catalog of divinities under polytheism in ancient myth. He says, myth is a condensed or metaphoric presentation of primal psychology. Primal psychology. Carl Sagan would be going, yes, I knew it. Myths are primitive science. I knew it. But that's not exactly what Kenneth means. He says, and thus a nomenclature or taxonomy for human vices and virtues. Right? The myths are being used to help us tease out the different ways in which people can go right and wrong, and to make sure that we all share these stories so that we can understand each other when we talk about, what's a wise policy or a foolish policy based on how people work. And this goes to Zelig's question about, do we agree on anything? The Greeks would have thought, well, if you can't agree on these basics, Aristotle basically says when he's describing the forms of government, good and bad, if the people voting don't agree on the basics, there's no point in even having the vote because nothing good is going to come out of that. You need to have some shared idea of who you are and what you're trying to accomplish. says the latent powers to which humans are subject are made palpable to intuitive minds. He means to gnosis, in the form of allegories or symbolic stories. The stories allow us to immerse ourselves in the experience of the story, and thus our gnosis is engaged to remember the experience and be able to recognize it later on and bring us back to that experience very rapidly. He says, for those literate in the myths, it becomes possible to see and articulate the arcane subterranean issues of human life, right? So it may be very hard to talk precisely about how Oedipus went wrong in Oedipus Tyrannus, but if we've all seen it, we don't actually need all that language. All we need is the finger pointing to the moon. We can say in the middle of a complicated experience, one of us could turn to another, go, uh-oh, Oedipus. And the other, after just a moment, could go, oh, God, you're right. Now, these are simple, short words. You didn't need a huge, complicated, taxonomy of precise terms and mathematical relationships among them. And yet you were able to describe an incredibly complicated situation full of paradox and tragedy, a liability of the human condition. And that's all made possible through the complex pattern recognition power of gnosis. This is what myths make possible. And this is using a completely alien faculty of the mind from noesis. That's kind of what that's kind of the point of this from an ancient perspective. So the final clause from this: one rises by virtue of the formatting metaphors of myths to a second order or more Olympian perspective on the changes in one's psychological weather. That is to say, you gain a new perspective through myth, a perspective that you didn't have through your own personal experience in life. By going through the carefully selected perspectives of these additional lives that are so illuminating, we get the ability to look back on our own life and triangulate on what's happening to us. And rather than being lost among the trees, we can step back and realize there's a forest here. This is when he says more Olympian perspective. Again, this is harking back to the Heraclitean line that only the divine nature has real understanding, because it's not trapped within the mortal experience. It's able to look from a distance. Closer to the Archimedean perspective, where you stand outside the world and you look back on it and you're able to see the things you couldn't see while you were within it. So what he's saying here is, because myths are stories, and because stories are accessible to every human being, even the most benighted human being can hear a story. And if the stories aren't predatory and they're not just neutral, but if they're actually carefully selected to help illuminate these critical aspects of life and our own psychology, then even somebody who's really, really stupid can get a little bit of the divine perspective on himself. This is what the ancients thought. This is why they made every Greek read the Iliad or hear the Iliad or have the Iliad read to them or something. They needed to be immersed in the story of the Iliad because they were confident that this is a way of, exposing people to wisdom that will allow them to become less foolish. It won't necessarily change their character like some night and day transformation, but it will give them the possibility of getting some perspective on themselves, and therefore maybe being able to make better decisions in their lives than they would have made otherwise. So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Surely you're not suggesting to me that I could absolve myself from reading Kant.
Sorry, man. I can't help you with that. So this is interesting because, if you think about this, I'm gonna wrap up with this observation. Again, the point of chapter 4 is to help immerse us in the ancient perspective so thoroughly that we then afterwards are able to adopt that perspective at will and look at the same situation, not just the way we normally would, but to be able to step outside ourselves and go, how would this look if I were ancient me instead of modern me? and to see the things that modern me misses, because it's typical of the modern perspective to miss the things that are characteristic of it. And so one of the things about this, if we're trying to emphasize the alienness of this, if you look at the structure of the ancient, let's look at the Greeks, in Athens or Sparta or any of the Greeks, they were deliberately using storytelling not as a way to become famous, not as a way to make some money, not as a way to pass the time, not any of the things that a modern would use a story for. They were using storytelling to try to save their civilization. They believed that they needed to do this to avoid the mistakes of the Trojan War, to avoid another dark age, to avoid self-destruction. They needed to tell stories, and not just any stories, but the right stories, the stories that would illuminate the kinds of passions and foolishness that led to the earlier collapse. And they believed if they did that correctly, they could save civilization. Moderns don't believe storytelling has that power. We think stories can be used to make money. We think they can be used to entertain people or pass the time. But if you look at the structure of the law, if you look at the structure of the economy, you'll see nothing in it anywhere that says stories are essential. And furthermore, the stories that are essential are the ones that are mythic and help us to understand the human condition. That's nowhere, anywhere in the structure of the modern world. And so this is one of the things that he's trying to do in chapter 4 is to help us to see how completely radically different the ancient perspective is from the modern perspective. And that's where I wrap up for today. Zella, go ahead. You got a comment.
Yeah, we were very separated from conceiving anything of spirit or soul or what we would call personality, right? So these markings on a paper or these words or these rhythms and poetry or sounds, like that has nothing to imprint in us because we believe we are physical. We're more we no longer believe we're psychophysical. We're more physical in totality. So that's why in our American culture, I think our religious worship is Sunday morning football or the Super Bowl, because we believe that is in the field that we would call this character, where it is formed, where our men, our respectable men, are made in the field or war. I think that's why at the root of it, we believe that in order for you to become a citizen in America, you know, we give great respect for people who fight in wars, because intrinsically we believe that it is going to war, killing the enemy, going through difficult situations that imprint these situations of courage, of love, of community. But is it really true? Because most of these young men and women are coming back home with PTSD. And so reading a tragedy about a war, it's not as dangerous as going to war in Kuwait and coming back with PTSD. And I think the ancients knew that, where it was wise to learn from others' mistakes without having to do it yourself. And I think we no longer believe in America. In America, I believe that if unless you're in a sport or an observer of sport, or going to war, or an observer of war, or politics, right? You're cultivating your character, even though they don't use those terms. But anything that is spiritual or character of the mind, they're like, yeah, that doesn't work. You need to punch me in the face. You need to imprint something into my physicality. Otherwise, I don't learn. You're never going to teach me what's a good citizen unless you physically get me to do that. And I think that's where we're at. That's why in the Western world, poetry, philosophy, there's so many jokes, you know, about philosophers and sociologists, and they're the lowest paid, because in society we don't believe that they make the voter, the citizen, the mother, the father, Boy Scouts. It's irrelevant now, right? And that was one of the last institutions that created the upright citizen. Like we are like, we're always asking the question, who gives you the right to tell people how to become or what kind of character? Like, who are you? Like, let me decide. And it's like, oh, so you want to start from age 0? Okay, let's see how that works out. and so we're kind of like warped into like multiple eras, even though we're in the 21st century. We're like, yeah, let me start civilization from 0 and learn everything by myself again. It's like, whoa, that thing, I think that's where we're at. That's why it's not valued.
Yeah. It's a lot of existentialist philosophical commentators have remarked on one of the key characteristics of the modern age is that in the place where ancients and medievals put all the value that people have or the world has or the divine has, moderns have basically reduced all those things to 0. Everything's just a resource to be used, even people, until ultimately nothing really matters. The foundation is nihilism underneath everything. Bye, Sharon. See you next week. And that's ultimately a house of cards. So anyway, thanks everybody. I hope you have a great week, and we'll pick this up again next week.